Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Today, I saw the devil. When most people hear the word devil, they think of a red man with horns and a stake. Well, in this case, it was a man in complete human form. I convinced myself I didn't need new clothes, but I was aching to get out of the house. I decided to head to a local thrift shop to kill some time before dinner. I tried on a few outfits here and there, gawked at mannequins, and eavesdropped on a few fellow shoppers' reality TV show-worthy drama. As I was finishing up my shopping, I noticed that my body and mind felt different. I had chills up and down my body, covering every inch. I got nauseous, but tried to ignore the feeling. My mind was spinning. I felt confused and disoriented. For a few moments I didn't even know where I was or why I was there. It startled me a bit, but I didn't want to stress it. Since I didn't feel well, I told myself it was time to head home. I left the store without buying a single thing, and that's harder than it sounds for a girl like me in a thrift shop, and I walked out the door into the parking lot to find my car. I was about halfway to my destination when a truck pulled up next to me and stopped. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it. All of a sudden, the sky got dark. Everything was blurry. The truck's engine turned off. A man in his late 40s climbed out of his pickup and headed toward the truck bed. I felt extremely uneasy and knew something wasn't right, but I continued to make my way to the place I had parked. Just then, I heard a voice in my head. It wasn't a human voice, nor did I hear actual words. It was more of a feeling telling me to run. I looked back at the man once more. This time we made eye contact. Never before have I feared for my life the way I did in that very moment when our eyes met. His eyes were black. Black as night without a moon. He grinned the most evil grin, showing off his yellow and rotten teeth. He began to walk toward me, and I muttered a few unrepeatable words, still unable to take my eyes off of him. I kept feeling like it was a dream, a nightmare. I wanted so badly to wake up from this traumatizing moment, but I couldn't. The man had something in his hands as he continued in my direction. I broke eye contact, caught what I could of my breath, and made a run for it. Keys in hand, I jumped in my front seat, slammed and locked the door, and took off for home. Once I felt I was a safe distance from what had just occurred, I pulled over. I was shaking uncontrollably, dizzy, unable to breathe, nauseated, scared, in awe. I could not comprehend what I had seen. My mind just wouldn't let me. As I began to catch my breath and calm myself as much as I could, the sky started to become light again. The world around me was no longer black or fuzzy, but finally in focus. Then it hit me. I realized what I had seen, and it was something I had never expected to see in my lifetime. God had shown me a glimpse of the devil. And let me tell you, it's not something to ever want or hope to see. When the evil feeling consumed me in that parking lot, I felt as though I was going to be harmed, that my life was in danger, that I would be taken or hurt. The man did not speak a word, nor make a sound, and although I had finally made it home physically safe and sound in what felt like a drive that lasted forever, my mind will never forget what I saw on October 15th, 2015. Today, I saw the devil. The year was 1999. I don't remember the month, but it was the beginning of cold, stormy weather. I was living with my parents in Tranquility, California at the time. I was partying with some friends in the town of San Joaquin, which is 8 miles away from Tranquility. We were having a good time, and as the party went on past midnight, I got into a fight with a guy that was drunk and causing trouble. I had too much to drink as well, and after they broke us up, I decided it was time for me to go home. I had come to the party with a friend of mine. We came in his car, and when I went looking for him, I was told he took off earlier with someone and didn't tell anyone where he was going or when he was coming back. Well, I didn't want to stick around anymore, so I started getting ready to walk home using the main highway that connected the two towns. Others tried to persuade me to stay and wait for my friend, but in my state, my mind was made up. I remember it was cold and windy that night, and it wasn't the best decision for me to walk the 8 miles home alone, but I figured I would hitchhike and hopefully someone would give me a ride. I just wanted to get home and go to sleep. So I said my goodbyes and started walking. I was around 1/3 of the way when I realized I made a mistake. I should have stayed and waited for my lame friend. That's when I saw some headlights coming toward me in the same direction I was walking. I stuck out my thumb and the car drove past me and kept going. Then another car came down the road and did the same thing. It was beginning to get very cold and there were some lightning flashes. I was getting ready to turn around and go back when I saw another car coming down the road, so I stuck out my thumb and it too drove past me. But as soon as it did, the brake lights came on and it pulled over. I started running up to the car, relieved I was finally going to get a ride and get out of the cold. As I approached the car, the driver's door opened and the driver got out. There was something totally wrong with the way he exited the vehicle. I mean, his body movements were sort of stiff and awkward. When I got closer, I started to say something when suddenly a bright lightning bolt flashed across the sky. It lit everything up, and I got a good glimpse of the driver. He looked like one of those mannequins you see in those big department stores. A blank facial expression with a slight smile, and the way it was walking. Man, I became incredibly frightened. Then the passenger door opened and another occupant stepped out in the same awful manner. I could tell by its silhouette against the headlights shining down the road that it was female, and another lightning bolt flashed revealing she too was a dummy. I think I screamed, then I ran into the cornfield that was next to the road. The corn was almost 6 feet tall and had recently been irrigated because I was running in mud that was up to my ankles. I just kept going, not stopping. It was tiring running through the mud, and just for a few minutes I did stop to catch my breath. In that moment I could hear somewhere behind me the corn stalks being rustled. I was beginning to feel lightheaded and dizzy, like I was going to pass out. Then I heard car doors slamming shut and the sound of the car driving away. I didn't go back to the highway. No way, I was too scared. I kept plodding through the cornfield until I came out the other side. That's when I sort of collapsed. I was shaking all over. I stayed there for at least an hour before I headed back to San Joaquin. To this day, when I think back, it could have been someone playing a joke just to scare people. I don't know. They looked real to me, and it was like a nightmare. I'm still not quite sure if what I'm about to tell you actually happened or not. It could have been a really bad nightmare. At least that's what I've been trying to tell myself for years now. Has anyone ever heard of the pig lady? Well, when I heard of her, I was around 12 years old in 2005. I had stayed over at a friend's house and we stayed up all night telling each other scary stories. Then one girl told us about the pig lady. She said that it's someone who has a woman's body with the face of a pig. You have to say her name 3 times and she would appear and chase you. There was no way that I believed that. Then she said it actually happened to her and some old friends of hers before. She told me about how the pig lady had chased them through the woods. I didn't believe a word that she was saying, but I played along anyway. After a moment, she decided to say her name 3 times. Pig lady, pig lady, pig lady. Nothing happened. I decided that it was just an old scare myth that wasn't the least bit true. After the stories were over and we went to sleep, it was thundering and lightning outside. Since the bed was right under the window and we had no curtains up, everyone made me sleep on the side of the bed directly under the window. Both of my friends had went to sleep before me, and I had stayed awake listening to the rain. Then, all of a sudden, there was a bolt of lightning, and I could have sworn in that split second that I had saw someone standing at that window. But as soon as I blinked my eyes, they were gone. I kept telling myself that I was just imagining things, and that I had to fall asleep, and in the morning everything would be fine. When I woke the next morning, my two friends decided they wanted to walk to the store. So I got up, took a bath, got dressed, and was ready to go. As we walked, again we started talking about the pig lady, and again one of my friends said her name 3 times. Then, we all yelled at her at the top of our lungs 3 times. The next thing we knew, we heard footsteps behind us. On the specific road we were on, there was nothing but trees around us. My friend's house was the only house on that road, and the nearest neighbors were closer to the store almost another mile away. All of us were afraid to look behind us, but every time we stopped walking, the footsteps stopped as well. Do you all hear that too? One of the girls asked me. Hear what? I asked, being in denial. Before anyone could respond, I decided to turn my head for just a second to see exactly what was going on, and immediately I wished I didn't. The sight I saw was the worst thing I had ever seen in my life. It was a woman dressed in a blue jumpsuit with a baseball cap on. As soon as I looked behind me, she lifted her head, and I saw the face of a pig. I took off running and screaming without looking back. I knew that my friends were somewhere behind or beside me because I could hear their screams over my own. When we reached the store 10 minutes later, I took a chance and looked behind me again, but I saw nothing. I didn't stop running until I got inside the store though, and I didn't see a trace of anything but me and my friends. We looked at each other, all out of breath and not sure if what just happened actually happened. We called the girl's mom and asked her to pick us up because we saw a strange guy watching us. To this day, we swore that it never actually happened. We swore it was just our own imagination. But how could we all have imagined the same thing? And how did that person just up and disappear? These are the questions that we have avoided throughout the years and will continue to avoid. In the early 1970s, my older cousin and his family lived 6 miles south, 2 miles east of St. Francis, South Dakota, in an area known as Bull Creek, named for bulls that were pastured in that area. My cousin and several other relatives had a drinking party on a Friday evening. As the party went on, the beer was getting low, so he and his son were elected to make a run to get more in the bordering town of Kilgore, Nebraska, 10 miles south of Bull Creek. He got to the main road and turned south. About 2 miles into the trip, he saw a man and woman walking. My cousin didn't give it a thought as he stopped the car and poked his head out and said in Lakota, "Get in, we'll give you a ride." To his surprise, there were no walkers. They had simply vanished. He said goosebumps ran up and down his body, but he threw the car into drive and continued on. About another 2 miles down the road, the same 2 walkers were on the road south. Again, my cousin stopped to offer a ride, but again, the walkers disappeared. My cousin zoomed into Kilgore and bought the beer, opened a can and poured out the contents and drove home. No more incidences on the way home. When he got back to the party and told what had happened, the party came to an almost dead stop as they all looked at each other, scared. One had the presence of mind to light a sage even while drinking. After that, all went home. Since that time, A few persons have related that they too saw the hitchhikers and offered them a ride, but they too disappeared. However, by word of mouth, no one is to walk that road after dark, drunk or sober, because of the walkers. This was related to me in 1997 when the wife of my cousin talked about it. Though terrifying, it hasn't slowed down the traffic to Kilgore to buy booze. This event took place in July 1991 in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, Canada. My husband and I bought a small home in the country. It was a quiet, peaceful area with dairy farms and rolling hills. We had lived there a few weeks when one night we were awoken by the sounds of what seemed to be two women in a heated argument. We both got up, looked around both in the house and outside, but everything was still and quiet. We thought it strange because the neighbor's dog would have barked if anyone was around, and the motion detector lights would have come on if anyone had been around. A few nights later, the same thing happened. I happened to be in the yard the next day when the lady from the next house over was walking by, so I asked if she had heard the argument during the night. She said she hadn't heard anything. It was quiet for a few days. Then one morning at around 7 a.m., I woke up to the smell of coffee and fresh bread, so I got up and went into the kitchen. Nothing. This happened almost every morning after that. Our grandkids came to visit and played in the yard often. When they went home, we could hear a small child cry. We would look around, but of course there would be no one around. This happened after my grandkids went home almost every time. It was like this little ghost missed them. Once I even heard the voice of a little girl say, "Grandma." I read some books on ghosts, which said not to be afraid and speak out to the ghost, so I did. I told the child to keep asking for her grandma to come and help. Shortly after, it stopped. I would guess her grandma came for her. It was kind of sad, but I hope I did the right thing by talking to her. The other things continued all the time we lived there. We had a new roof put on the house, and the roofer said there had been a fire in the house. There were burn marks over the kitchen area. We figured this is what had happened. We sold the house, and the new owners tore the house down and built a new one, so I never did find out about our former home and the history behind it. I moved into my home in January of 1991. On the first night, I was awoken by a low, wavering voice calling for John. I sat up in bed and looked around my room. Then I went to the window to see if someone was outside. It was a cold winter night and no one was around. I went back to bed only to hear the same voice calling for John. I sat up in my bed and told the voice to get out and that this was my house. The voice stopped. Several months later, after I got to know my neighbor, I asked her who had lived in my home and told her about my story. She informed me that a family had lived there for about 20 years and they had a son named John. She also said the woman had died and the house was sold. John would be in his late 50s now, and he was an alcoholic. My 8-year-old granddaughter Jenny shared my home with me. Jenny would come into my room at night and tell me she woke up and knew the ghost was standing beside her bed. Also, things would disappear only to then reappear. This went on for a year or so. Then one morning, as I was getting ready for work, I heard Jenny upstairs. She was in my bed, as the ghost had woken her up during the night. I ran upstairs to find a terrified child in my bed. She said she saw the ghost standing beside her and described a small woman with dark hair. She also said the ghost touched her on the leg and her whole body was tingling. Several years later, my son and 2-year-old grandson came to live with me, and my son started missing objects like scissors, etc., only to have them mysteriously reappear. Then he began to wake up at night feeling the ghost standing and watching him. She was back. I feel her presence many nights as I sit in the living room by myself. I think we have learned to live with each other now. These experiences I'm writing about happened to me twice, many years apart. The first event was back around 1981 when I was a teenager, maybe 16 years old. I was at my home in Burnaby, British Columbia, Canada. I was alone outside on the back deck reading a book and fully engrossed in it. Slowly, I started to become aware of a strange noise that seemed to be getting closer. It sounded somewhat like an animal crying, but also sort of human, like a little child. Kind of a crying, whimpering sound, but not a sound I could identify. I finally put down my book and started looking over the deck into the yard to find the source of this strange sound. The weird thing is that the sound became louder and closer sounding, but nothing appeared to be making the sound. It sounded as though whatever was making the noise was only a few feet away, but nothing was there. I started to get a bit spooked at this point, got my dog, and went down into the yard to investigate. When I got to the front yard, the noise stopped. I started looking around, but there was nothing to be seen, at least by me. However, my dog certainly seemed to see something in the flower bed next to the house. She started barking and growling with her hackles raised, but nothing was visible to me. I even pushed all the plants around, thinking there must have been a small animal hiding there. Nothing. I thought this was really unusual and could find no explanation for it, but since it stopped, I sort of forgot about it. Everything seemed to be back to normal until later that night. I was watching TV in the living room with my mom and sister when we heard the strangest noise at the window. It sounded as if though someone had taken a wet hand and slowly ran it down the glass, making a squeaking type of noise. It scared the hell out of me. My mom and sister were spooked as well. None of us wanted to look outside to see what made the sound. Finally, we made my dad look outside, and nothing was there. The noise was blamed on kids playing a prank on us, even though that had never happened before or since. Fast forward to 1997. I'm now living in a different house in Surrey, British Columbia, with my husband and 10-month-old son. We had been in the house for about 4 months. I, my son, and the cat were the only ones in the house at the time. My son was in the living room with baby gates stopping him from crawling into the other rooms. I went into the kitchen to do something at the sink when I started to hear this weird crying sound again. My first thought was that something was wrong with my son, as that was not his normal cry at all. I went to look and saw that he wasn't making any sound at all. The noise was not coming from him. The sound was getting louder as I stood at the top of the stairs. The noise seemed to be traveling from the ground level and up the stairs. I could hear the sound as it passed by me, went through the kitchen and to the back door and stopped. It reminded me of the sound I heard back in 1981. Another strange thing is that even after the sound stopped, my cat was freaked out about that kitchen door for the next few days. He was scared to go through it, even though he had been using it since we had moved in. A weird little coincidence I would like to mention is that a similar thing happened many years earlier to my grandparents, back before they were married around 1932. They had a similar experience in my great-grandparents' house, which was located on a farm near Winnipeg, Manitoba. My grandparents were sitting at the kitchen table one evening when a crying sound started moving around the table. They followed the sound outside to a barn where it eventually stopped. No explanation could be found. It seems to me that all these events are related. Perhaps my family is haunted by a crying ghost. I wonder if anyone else has had a similar experience or has any explanation for it. I was about 14, and my best friend Missy was about 17. We lived in a very small town in northern Michigan. I stayed overnight at her house on the weekends often. We would usually play cards, watch TV, or go for walks around the small lake that was the central part of our small town. I heard her tell a story to her parents, other friends, and she would tell it to me often too. I heard the babies crying again last night, she would say. She described hearing babies cry outside her bedroom in the hallway, always at night. Her bedroom was the only room on the second floor. To get there, we would go up the stairs, turn to the right, and walk down a hall parallel to the staircase to get to her room at the end of the hall. I heard her tell this story many times, and I did not disbelieve her. I just listened and thought, that's weird, I guess. Missy and I were not the type of people to gossip or make up things, and I couldn't see her making up this story to get attention or anything, but I would usually just dismiss it and we'd go on about our day. Until one night when I heard them for myself. I slept on a pile of blankets and pillows, a blanket nest, at the end of her bed. We just turned out the light and said goodnight to each other. About a minute later, I began to hear a baby crying. I said, "Missy, I hear them." She said, "Don't worry, it will stop soon." So I didn't worry. I just listened. The sound went from one baby crying to maybe 3. Then it sounded like it went back down to one baby again, then back to multiple babies crying. It went on like this for maybe 4 or 5 minutes. It was quite a while, and I remember thinking to myself in somewhat of an annoyance, when will this stop? Because it seemed like it had been lasting for quite a while. When it finally ended, I think I said something like, "I don't hear them anymore," and we went back to sleep. Ever since then, I believe in ghosts, not only because I actually heard them myself, but because we both heard them at the same time, and because I had heard of her tell the story so many times before. We never did learn the backstory of where these babies came from, or what their history was. It was very strange, to say the least. My house isn't very old, but a lot of strange things have happened to me there. I've always enjoyed ghost stories and such, so I guess I've let them in. The first time it happened was when I was about 6. I'm 14 now. I went out to the living room and set down my stuffed toy on its side. I turned back around and noticed it was now on all 4s. It was a stuffed Webkinz dog. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The next thing happened last year. My room in my house is right above the workshop that a man before us had built when he built the basement. When I sit in my room through the vent system, I can hear voices in the basement, even when there is no one down there or any televisions or radios on. It's usually a man and a woman talking, and the man seems to be angry, swearing and yelling and such, while the woman cries and he throws things around. This year, however, it got worse. Lately, I've seen a woman in a long white dress pass through my living room in the morning, and when I went to shower one morning, I heard someone walking around and then laughing from a woman, even though I was home alone. I've also had a few problems only in my room. One morning as I'm waking up from a dream about demon-like things attacking me, I felt a cold chill run up my spine and begin to make me shake uncontrollably. I couldn't move or scream, and I was afraid to open my eyes. Then I heard a whisper in my ear saying, "Thank you for the things you're going to remember in your head." Lastly, one night a few weeks ago, as I lay in my bed, I looked to my wall and saw a shadow of a person sitting. It seemed he had a cloak or something on, and I, assuming it was a shadow or something in my room, got up and moved things on and around my bed to dispel the shadow, but it didn't move. Later that night, when it was still there, I put my foot down where it would be and felt an insane sensation of cold. It has been there every night since. This happened on July 21st, 2011. I was on my way home after spending the whole day in the town of Alice, Texas. I'm a construction worker and I was looking at some possible jobs. I went to 3 homes that day. I talked to the owners to see what they wanted done and gave them an estimate. It was 6 in the evening when I started to head back to Beeville. But before I got on the main highway, I stopped at a restaurant and had some dinner along with a couple of beers. It was almost 8 when I started down the highway. It was beginning to get dark, and as I drove, I went over the job numbers in my mind. One of them was very promising with the potential of making a good profit. I called my partner on my phone and discussed the details of the job with him. I told him we'd get together tomorrow and hung up. I was halfway to Beeville when I noticed up ahead some moving white lights that were on the left side of the road. The area I was in gets very dark at night, and those dancing lights were the only thing visible against the black background, and there was no traffic on the road besides myself. As I got closer, the lights started changing colors. They went from white to green, blue, and then red. When I was adjacent to the lights, I slowed down to get a better look. Then I stopped. I thought maybe it was another vehicle or something. The lights were bright and would move up and down, then move in a circular motion. I would say the lights were about a quarter mile away, but it was hard to judge the distance in the dark. I started thinking about the stories and reports I've read about people who have seen UFOs, aliens, and strange lights in the sky, all that stuff, and began to conclude I might be having my own encounter. I turned off the engine, leaving my headlights on, and rolled down my window in an effort to hear any sound coming from the lights. I heard nothing. It was kind of spooky. The lights were zigzagging, going up and down, when suddenly they grouped together and became motionless, like they were aware of me. Slowly, they started to get brighter and I realized they were coming toward me. I decided I'd had enough and started my truck, but as soon as I did, my engine died. I tried starting it again, but it wouldn't start properly. The engine was sluggish. I turned off the lights, thinking maybe that would help. Meanwhile, the lights turned into a gold color and were still getting brighter. I tried again to start the engine, and this time it did. Then a startling thing happened. When I turned my headlights on, their beams started to bend toward the approaching lights. I kid you not. I've never seen the likes of that before. Is that even possible? I put it into drive and got the hell out of there. The beams straightened out as I punched it. I kept looking back in my mirror at the lights, and when they came in line with the highway, I saw the same effect of them getting brighter, which meant they were following me. Now I was scared. I was thinking, what are they? Are they some kind of aircraft or what? My speed was up to 80 miles per hour and I was beginning to sweat like a dog. I looked in my mirror again, and now there were only one light. But that was a false impression because the lights were traveling in a single file formation. They caught up and passed over me, one after the other, lighting up the interior of my truck in a golden hue. The lights went on down the highway ahead of me, reflecting their brightness off of the ground. I slowed down and let them have the road. As I did, the lights made a left turn in that same single-file formation and headed toward the east. Again, my headlight beams started to bend in their direction. It was simply amazing. The strange lights continued on their easterly path until they were obscured by my view by, I imagined, some hills. All this time, my headlight beams would start to bend, then straighten out, then start to bend again. Incredible. I didn't see the golden lights anymore for the remainder of my trip. I was very shaken up by the whole experience, and I was so relieved when I finally reached home. In Navajo legend, a Skinwalker is a medicine man who has gone to the dark side and is able to shapeshift into animals and other people. By night, they transform and inflict pain and suffering. All of her life, Frances has seen things, heard things, and felt them. Born into a family of sensitives, this was rather normal. In my family, you were considered odd if you didn't experience abnormal things, Frances says. We've talked much about our experiences or our feelings about them. We just accepted them as normal, which in fact to us they are. But nothing could have prepared our family for what they encountered on a dark, desolate road in Arizona 20 years ago. It's a mysterious and traumatizing event that haunts them to this day. Frances's family had moved from Wyoming to Flagstaff, Arizona in 1978, shortly after her high school graduation. Sometime between 1982 and 1983, 20-year-old Frances, her father, mother, and her younger brother took a road trip back to Wyoming in the family pickup truck. The trip was a vacation to visit with friends in and around their old hometown. The only member of the family not present was her older brother, who was in the Army and stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The course along Route 163 took them through the Navajo Indian Reservation and through the town of Kayenta, just south of the Utah border and the magnificent Monument Valley Navajo Tribal Park. Anyone who has lived in Arizona for any length of time knows that the Indian Reservation can be a beautiful, if harsh, place for non-natives. Many strange things happened out there, Frances says. Even my friend, a Navajo, warned us of traveling through the reservation, especially at night. Along with the warning, however, Frances's Native American friends blessed the family, and they were on their way. The trip to Wyoming was uneventful, but the trip back to Arizona along the same route more than justified the warning from Frances's friend. It still gives me goosebumps, she says. To this day, I have major anxiety attacks when I travel through the North Country at night. I avoid it at all costs. It was a warm summer night, about 10 p.m., when the family's pickup was heading south on 163, about 20 to 30 miles from the town of Kayenta. It was a moonless night on this lonely stretch of road, so pitch black that they could only see just a few feet beyond the headlights, so dark that closing their eyes actually brought relief from the fathomless black. They had been driving for hours with Frances's father at the wheel, and the vehicle's passengers had long ago settled into quiet. Frances and her father sandwiched her mother in the truck's cab, while her brother enjoyed the night air in the back of the pickup. Suddenly, Frances's father broke the silence. "We have company," he said. Frances and her mother turned around and looked out the back slider window. Sure enough, a pair of headlights appeared over the crest of a hill, then disappeared as the car went down, then reappeared. Frances commented to her father that it was nice to have company on this stretch of road. If something went wrong, neither vehicle and its passengers would be alone. Thunder began to rumble from the vast clouded sky. The parents decided that their son should come into the cab before he got soaking wet from any rain that might fall. Frances opened the slider window and her brother crawled in, squeezing between her and her mother. Frances turned to close the window and again noticed the headlights from the following car. "They're still behind us," her father said. "They must be going to either Flagstaff or Phoenix. We'll probably meet them in Kayenta when we stop to fuel up." Frances watched as the car's headlights crested another hill and began its descent until it disappeared. She watched for them to reappear, and watched. They didn't reappear. She told her father that the car should have crested the other hill again, but hadn't. Maybe they slowed, he suggested, or pulled over. And that was possible, but it just didn't make sense to Frances. Why in the hell would a driver slow down or, worse yet, stop at the bottom of a hill in the middle of the night with nothing around for miles and miles? Frances asked this of her father. You'd think they'd want to keep sight of the car in front of them in case anything happened, she said. People do weird stuff when they are driving, her father replied. So Frances kept watching, turning around every few minutes to check for those headlights, but they never did reappear. When she turned to look one last time, she noticed that the pickup was slowing down. Turning back to look out the windshield, she saw that they were rounding a sharp bend in the road, and her father had slowed the truck down to about 55 miles per hour. And from that moment, time itself seemed to slow down for Frances. The atmosphere changed somehow, taking on an otherworldly quality. Frances turned her head to look out the passenger window when her mother screamed and her father cried out, "Jesus Christ! What the hell is that?" Frances didn't know what was happening, but one hand instinctively reached over and held down the button for the lock door, and the other tightly grabbed the door handle. She braced her back against her small brother and held firmly onto the door, still not knowing quite why. Her brother was now yelling, "What is it? What is it?" Her father immediately flipped on the interior cab light, and Frances could see that he was petrified. "I've never, ever seen my father that scared in my whole life," Frances says. "Not when he came home from his tours in Vietnam, not when he came home from special assignments, not even when someone tried to firebomb our house." Frances's father was white as a ghost. She could see the hair on the back of his neck standing straight out like a cat's, and so was the hair on his arms. She could even see the goosebumps on his skin. Panic was filling the small cab. Frances's mother was so frightened that she began shouting in her native Japanese in a high, squeaky voice as she frantically wrung her hands. The little boy just kept saying, "Oh my God!" As the pickup sped around the bend in the road, Frances could see that the shoulder dropped off deeply into a ditch. Her father slammed on the brakes to prevent the truck from swerving into the ditch. As the pickup was slowing to a stop, something leaped out of the ditch at the side of the truck, and now Frances could clearly see what had started the panic. It was black and hairy, and was eye level with the passengers in the cab. If this was a man, it was like no man Frances had ever seen. Yet despite its monstrous appearance, whatever this thing was, it wore a man's clothes. It had on a white and blue checkered shirt and long pants, I think jeans, Frances testifies. Its arms were raised over its head, almost touching the top of the cab. This creature remained there for a few seconds, looking into the pickup, and then the pickup was past it. Frances could not believe what she had seen. It looked like a hairy man, or a hairy animal in man's clothing, she says. But it didn't look like an ape or anything like that. Its eyes were yellow, and its mouth was open. Although time seemed to freeze and distorted in this moment of fantastic horror, it was all over within a few minutes. The headlights, her little brother coming into the cab, and the thing. By the time the family reached Kayenta for gas, they had finally calmed down. Frances and her father climbed out of the pickup and checked the side of the truck to see if the creature had done any damage. They were surprised to see that the dust on the side of the truck was undisturbed, and so was the dust on the hood and roof of the truck. In fact, they found nothing out of the ordinary. No blood, no hair, nothing. The family stretched their legs and rested in Kayenta for about 20 minutes. The car that had been following them never did show up. It's as if the car simply vanished. They drove home to Flagstaff with the cab light on and the doors securely locked. "I wish I could say this was the end of the story," Frances says, but it's not. A few nights later, around 11 p.m., Frances and her brother were awakened by the sounds of drumming. They looked out his bedroom window into the backyard, which was surrounded by a fence. At first, they saw nothing but the forest beyond the fence. Then the drumming grew louder, and 3 or 4 men appeared behind the wooden fence. It looked like they were trying to climb the fence, but couldn't quite manage to bring their legs up high enough and swing over, Frances recalls. Unable to get into the yard, the men began to chant. Frances was so scared, she slept with her little brother that night. Sometime later, Frances sought out her Navajo friend, hoping she could offer some explanation for these strange incidents. She told Frances that it was a skinwalker that had tried to attack her family. Skinwalkers are creatures of Navajo legend, witches that can shapeshift into animals. That a skinwalker attacked them was quite unusual, Frances' friend told her, as it had been a long time since she had heard of any activity about skinwalkers and that they normally don't bother non-natives. Frances took her friend back by the fence where she had seen the strange men trying to climb in. The Navajo woman considered the scene for a moment, then revealed that 3 or 4 skinwalkers had visited the house. She said that they wanted the family, but could not gain access because something was protecting the family. Frances was astonished. Why, she asked. Why would the skinwalkers want her family? Your family has a lot of power, the Navajo woman said, and they wanted it. Again, she said that the skinwalkers usually don't bother non-natives, but she believed that they wanted the family enough to expose themselves. Later that day, she blessed the perimeter of the property, the house, the vehicles, and the family. We haven't been bothered by skinwalkers since then, Frances says. Then again, I haven't been back to Kayenta. I've gone through other towns on the reservation, yes, at night. But I'm not alone. I carry a weapon, and I carry protective amulets. In August 2013, my husband and I were driving home on Highway 36 from St. Joseph, Missouri to our home just north of Hiawatha, Kansas. Night had just fallen. It was just after 9 p.m. Between Wathena and Troy, there is a slight curve to the left. On the left side of the road is a picnic rest area and the remains of an old railroad bridge. On the right, a large, beautiful house. Just after the curve is an incline in the road. We were just beginning up the hill when in front of us was an explosion. Now my brain immediately told me it was a head-on collision. All we could see was thick, dense black smoke covering the entire width of the road. Glowing through the smoke, we could see the orange flames and the yellow light of the wrecked car's headlights. I felt panic through my body and immediately began putting my shoes back on. You know how your brain can think a million thoughts in a fraction of a second? I knew I was going to have to help people and possibly pull bodies out of a burning vehicle. The dust and smoke were thick as I stared out the windshield, trying to get a visual on the wreckage. I know I said something out loud. Maybe I just screamed. At the time, my husband was putting on the brakes and swerving onto the shoulder. We were about midway up the hill when he got the car stopped. Before we could get out of the car, everything disappeared. I'll say it again. Everything disappeared. It was like watching a movie explosion and rewind. All the smoke, dust, headlights, and flames seemed to just get sucked up into the air. I have no other way to describe it. There was nothing, not even a car on the highway in front of us. My husband and I looked at each other, then back out the windshield. We were stunned, speechless, and shaking. The vehicle that was behind us had also pulled over. They drove back onto the road and slowly went around us. They obviously saw something too. I remember asking my husband, "You saw that, right?" He replied, Yeah. Why do you think I slammed the brakes and pulled over?" The whole event was completely mind-boggling. We started back up the hill. I looked out the windows for cars down a ditch or ravine. The sides of the road were high, no ditches. The next day, I told my parents about what happened, and I also posted my experience on Facebook. My dad and several friends told me that 3 men were killed on that curve. I had never noticed it before, but there is in fact a cross on the side of the road next to the picnic area. 2 days and many Google searches later, I found the article on the crash. It took place in August 2007. It wasn't the anniversary day of the crash, but it was the same month. I tried to find more information and pictures of the crash site to see if the accident occurred on the hill, but to no luck. I'm not sure what I witnessed. Was it a tragic recreation of what happened 6 years prior? Who knows? But the images of what I saw and felt still haunt me. I'm interested in knowing if anyone else has experienced anything like this. Chicago, Illinois, 1977. This is an absolutely true story. My father tells this story every so often, and when he does, it gives me the chills. My parents, unmarried then, were driving to the west of Chicago on I-57 at 11 a.m., headed south when their car just died right in the middle of the highway lane. My father frantically tried to start the car, but with no luck. My mother says she was terrified because she knew it was a possibility that another car could smash into their car going over 70 miles per hour. They said cars were whizzing by, and the wind was so great that it would shake their little car. My father said that all of a sudden, they looked back and there was a black pickup truck right behind them. The truck was at a T-shaped formation, with the driver's side door so close to my parents' back bumper that it could have been touching. My father said that this truck just appeared out of the blue with no sign that it had ever been driven. My father stated that in order for this truck to make this perfect T position, it would have had to have made several different maneuvers, but it didn't. It was like it dropped there from the sky. My father told my mother, "What is this fool doing? He's going to get someone killed." My father said that the man in the truck never got out, never rolled down his window, nor did the man look my parents' way. The man just stayed looking forward, never even acknowledging my parents. My father described the man as having a long neck and sitting at attention like a soldier that has been given an order. After about 45 seconds, the car finally started. When my parents looked back to thank the man, the truck was gone. The only way for the truck to leave was to do a maneuver and drive past them, but it didn't. It just vanished. My parents now know that an angel, or perhaps something, was there to protect them, to preserve their future. Later in the future, my parents became ministers of the gospel and have ministered to people all over the world. My parents have always been extremely truthful people, and they recall this story as if it happened yesterday. This happened in Los Angeles, California in 2007. 3 of my friends and I decided to do something unforgettable for once and not stay home, watch a movie, or go out to some fun place like we always do. So my friend Nancy mentioned that we should all go to Gravity Hill. Let me just say that the time was 2:30 a.m., and without hesitation, we all agreed. As we drove there, we were all very excited because we had heard so many stories about this place. But as soon as we got to the turn point, I got a very uneasy feeling, and so did the other girls. It was 4 of us in the car. Then after thinking about it for a few minutes, we looked at each other and said, "Why not? We are already here. Might as well make the best of it," we thought. So we drove for a while to get up there. I thought it was going to be about a mile up the pitch black hill, but it turned out to be like 5. We were so scared that none of my friends and I said a word the entire ride. Upon arriving to this mysterious place, the first thing you see is a cemetery and a big white building. It almost looked like an insane asylum in the middle of a graveyard. I swear to this day that I saw someone or something walk across the cemetery in front of us, sort of like a shadowy figure. I looked at my phone to see what time it was. It was 3:15 a.m., and to make matters worse, there was no reception in all 4 cell phones, and we all have different company plans. We stopped right next to the cemetery, turned off the car, but we left it in neutral and waited in the pitch black. Within 5 minutes of sitting and looking around, the car started to move up the hill by itself. We looked at each other in disbelief. We became incredibly scared. I kept my eyes looking straight ahead because I was afraid to look outside the window thinking I might see someone next to me. My friend Nancy, who was driving, panicked and decided this was it and wanted to get out as soon as possible. Let me just mention that we were in her new car that she and her husband had just bought a week before. As she turned the car around to get out of this place, we drove slowly to see if we noticed anything lingering around, trying to be brave. And as we passed the cemetery, she tried to speed out, but the car couldn't go more than 20 miles per hour. Remember, this is a brand new car, so this kind of thing should not happen. We were terrified and she was freaking out, as were the others. She had her foot all the way down on the pedal, but the car wouldn't budge. Our bodies felt heavy, almost like the gravity was pulling us back, but we were far from the mystery point where the car moved on its own. I started to pray in silence because I couldn't stand the heaviness of my body and the fact that we were going nowhere at that speed. Believe it or not, the car didn't go any further than 20 miles per hour for about a mile. We were all worried that the car would just turn off and we would be stranded in the middle of a pitch-black hill with no phone signal. Little by little, the car started to speed faster, and once we hit the last turn to get out of the hills, my friend Kathy, who was sitting behind me, said that as we passed the last turn, she saw a figure standing next to a tree. So she closed her eyes and started to pray until we got out of the hill. Our other friend just closed her eyes and fell asleep, as she was a little drunk. We finally got home and decided that next time we go to this place, we will take a camera to see what we can capture. I would like to relay a death premonition I had as a child regarding my older brother. When I was 6, my oldest brother was 16. We were very close. In fact, he was more of a parent to me than a sibling. Just before Christmas that year, 1968, my family went to my brother's high school to watch his band's Christmas concert. There, in the high school auditorium, sitting in the dark, listening to the band play, something happened. The best way to describe it is to say death entered into my dimension. Even though I was so young, I remember so much about it, even small details like the purple velvet drapes covering the auditorium walls. One moment everything was fine. I was slightly bored, squirming in my seat, hoping the concert would be over sooner than later. The next moment, a dark, heavy feeling came upon me. It was overwhelming. I didn't know what was going on. Nothing obvious had happened, but something powerful and tragic had. I just didn't understand. From that moment, I knew something horrible was going to happen, something that would change my life forever, and in an awful way. I also knew it had to do completely with my big brother. I remember sitting there in the dark, silently crying, tears rolling down my face. I also remember being careful that no one else, especially my mother, saw what was going on with me. I knew if my mother saw the tears, she would wonder and ask me why I was crying, and I didn't know how to answer that question. My limited vocabulary would have made what I was feeling impossible to express, and my mother was not one to accept no for an answer. So there I sat in the dark auditorium, staring at those velvet curtains, trying desperately to understand what was going on and wanting the feeling I was experiencing to go away. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent as much time with my brother as possible. As I said before, he was more of a parent to me, so I usually spent most of my time with him, but this was different. I was obsessed with having him in my sight, followed him like a shadow. I would have probably told him, but once again, I lacked the words or even the understanding to express my feelings to him. I would panic any time he left the house and be so relieved when he came back home. But the whole time, the heavy, horrible presence never lifted. A week into the new year, I was woken up by a pastor's wife instead of by my brother. The moment I opened my eyes and saw her next to my bed instead of my brother, I knew he was gone, and I knew he would never be back. That dark feeling was also gone, replaced with a different feeling. one of total grief and remorse. I remember being very defiant with our pastor's wife. When she asked me what clothes I wanted to put on, I told her, "Billy dresses me every morning. I will wait for Billy to come in and get me dressed." I was saying these things to see what response they would get from her, because I knew the reason why she was here was because Billy wasn't. After dressing me, she took me downstairs where I and my 3 other brothers met with our pastor, and he told us that Billy had been in a car accident the night before and was no longer with us. Back in the 80s, when I was about 8, I lived in East Sussex in the UK. I went to school at Michael Hall. My mother was a teacher there, so I got to go for free. On the school grounds is the Kidbrooke Mansion, which was built in 1735, where at the time many of the teachers actually lived. We were fairly new there and I didn't know much about the place, but one of the teachers' kids had a birthday and I was invited for a sleepover at the mansion. Typical kid birthday stuff ensues and we all go to bed eventually. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up and needed to piddle. So I crept out of the room and wandered around the great halls till I eventually found a bathroom and did what I needed to do. However, when I set off back to bed, I found I was completely lost. I was wandering around when a woman stepped out of a doorway. She was dressed in a long white nightgown with a high lacy neck and white robe over it belted around her waist. She smiled at me and I said, "I'm lost. I want to go back to bed." And she turned around and started walking down the hall. I followed her. After a couple of turns, she stopped by a doorway. I came close, looked in, and there was my bed. I turned around to say thank you, and she was gone. I just went to bed without thinking about it any further. The next morning, everyone was sitting around the table at breakfast, and I was looking around for the lady to say thank you to her, but I couldn't see her. So I asked one of the adults where she was. I ended up having to tell the whole story and describe what she looked like, etc., and one of the adults said it must have been Lady Kidbrooke, and I shouldn't worry about it. So I didn't. I just said that if they saw her to tell her thank you and went back to my porridge. Over the years, I found out that there had not been a Lady Kidbrooke at the mansion for a few hundred years. The story goes that Lord Kidbrooke adored his wife and built the mansion for her. They had 3 children and were happy and rich. There's a few weird stories attached to the local history of the mansion, including that the oldest child, a boy, was a known sadist who tortured the servants and killed at least one, a black child brought over as a novelty status symbol servant. Shortly after the child died, though, there was a terrible fire which started in the east wing of the mansion where the children slept. Everyone got out except the oldest son and the youngest daughter. When Lady Kidbrooke realized 2 of her children were still in the house, she rushed back in before the servants could stop her and was killed. The younger was later found in the arms of a servant who had managed to get out of the back of the house but hadn't made it to where everyone else had gathered yet. So the 2 who died in the blaze were Lady Kidbrooke and her awful son. Did I meet the kindly Lady Kidbrooke in the halls as she looked for her own daughter? It was an incredibly vivid experience. It absolutely happened, and I never saw the woman I met in the halls again, so I know for a certain she wasn't a teacher there I didn't know, or a visitor, as the people there were teachers and their kids. At the time, visitors were not permitted at the mansion without approval from the board. I don't remember anything odd about her, other than she didn't speak to me. The other experience I can't explain happened about 4 years later. We were now living up in the north of Scotland, and my mother was teaching at Cluny Hill, another mansion and a community center for Findhorn Foundation. They wanted to open a school there for kids at the foundation. There was some event there over that particular weekend, and my mother was helping decorate the night before, and I was bumming around, a bit bored. I decided to go outside and swing. There was an awesome swing hanging off a huge tree on the edge of the gardens, so out I went. It was a dark, late autumn, around 8:30 or so. The moon was so bright I didn't bother taking a torch as I could see very well in the moonlight. I wandered down to the swing and set to flying. I must have been out there for half an hour easily, having a great time, till the sensation of being watched started. I slowly got more and more aware as I swung that something was staring at me. I started listening while trying to appear super nonchalant as I swung, and after a few minutes became aware of some quiet sounds. It sounded like something creeping extremely slowly through the wooded undergrowth and rhododendrons at the edge of the garden, coming slowly closer to where I was. My swinging got slower and slower as I listened. When I was absolutely certain someone was in the bushes about 10 feet from where I was, watching me, I stopped the swing, got off carefully and stared into the bushes. There was a slight, slow, deliberate movement. One of the shadows had shifted and I was reminded of the way my old tomcat would settle his shoulders down before he pounced at a bird. I whipped around and started running to the house. Something burst out of the bushes behind me and started chasing me across the lawn. I started screaming as I hit the driveway when I nearly fell. Whatever was chasing me was so close I could hear its huffing breath. Whatever was chasing me was big. I peeled up the driveway to the front door, hammered up the steps and into the alcove. As I got to there, the door opened and one of the teachers was standing there looking concerned. He looked over my head and I saw his jaw drop in utter terror. He screamed and snatched me and dragged me inside. As he grabbed my shoulder, I was whipped around and I saw a huge black hind end disappearing down the steps towards the lawn in front of the house. The last thing I saw was the flick of a long, thick tail. My teacher was still yelling as he slammed the door and locked it. At this point there was a lot of running around and yelling, and then the police showed up. I was in quite a lot of shock at this point, so most of it is a big blur at this point, honestly. I remember the teacher who had opened the door being completely white and needed to be sat down and calmed for quite a while. He swore up and down that what he'd seen chasing me was a big black panther. I don't know what was chasing me. I didn't clearly see it. All I know is something chased me, and it was a big animal. The police were not convinced and implied quite strongly that if I hadn't made the whole thing up, perhaps a stray dog had chased me and illicit substances were involved with what my teacher saw. The poor teacher started drinking heavily after this just to be able to sleep, and had a pretty major mental breakdown about 2 weeks after this and left the school. I was terrified of the woods for a long, long time. In fact, even now they make me extremely uncomfortable. This story isn't my story so much as it is my wife's. A few years ago, my wife and I decided to take a little trip to Gettysburg for her birthday. We were living in Maryland at the time, so it was a quick hop up there for a weekend getaway. Perhaps not the most romantic place on the planet, but we figured we'd see the battlefield and maybe take a corny ghost tour. When we arrived at the hotel the first night, we had just come from the battlefield tour, a self-guided CD tour which you can take in the comfort of your own car. We checked in and went to our room. We were tired and wanted to lay down for a few minutes before making our evening plans. We pulled back the sheets, and there were blood stains in them. Totally grossed out, we called the front desk and demanded clean sheets. We were told that they were out of clean sheets. This was a Comfort Inn, not exactly the Ritz, but that we could stay in the suite if we wanted. Well, who doesn't want a free upgrade? We were told that the suite was the building across the parking lot. It's a small house-like building in the middle of the parking lot, actually. There are 2 rooms, the upper and the lower. We were assigned the upper room, which was a suite complete with a large open living room, bedroom, good-sized bathroom, and a full kitchen. We were tickled pink. That night, we had dinner in town and we went on a ghost tour. It was interesting but not overly scary, and we didn't hear anything about our hotel or anything like that. It was a fun evening, and afterwards we were exhausted. We returned to the hotel at around 11 p.m. and hit the rack. Around 2 a.m., I am violently and noisily awakened by my wife, who is screaming at me to wake up. I do, and she tells me in a panic that before I woke up, I had a softball-sized orb of light hovering about 3 inches over my head. But as soon as she cried out to me, it vanished. I never saw it, but she swears up and down that it was there. She's not the kind of person who makes up stories, so I believe her. We later found out that the room we were staying in was, during the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate HQ complete with field hospital. It is considered one of the most haunted places in Gettysburg, and we had no idea at the time. To this day, my wife will swear she saw the orb, but doesn't like to talk about it because she's afraid people will think she's crazy. I was 17, still in high school, but didn't have much longer left. I was still dating my first ex-girlfriend at the time, and it's something she and I will never forget. Of course, we no longer talk, but it would be way too hard for anyone to forget something so extreme. We were having a nice night at her aunt's house about 12 miles away from my house. Her parents were close to my father, as they'd known each other for well over 15 years. So we were all very close, and she was coming back with me to spend the night. It was a pretty great time overall. The ride back was great. Both in great moods, didn't drink, didn't do drugs, both played high school sports. I remember everything was great up until we got to the road my dad lives on in a small town in the United States. It was around 11 p.m., and I remember as I approached the road, I hit my right turn signal, and I saw this kid walking in a red hoodie and blue shorts. I immediately tried to find rhyme or reason given the time of day, which was Saturday, and the kid looked no older than 11 or 12. What's he doing walking at this time? Is he okay? Where's he going? Rapid questions. It's a safe town and all, but what kid really roams the streets at 11 p.m.? I remember just before making the turn, every bit of joy or happiness I'd felt from the night's events were completely drained out and replaced with deep depression. Hugest mood swing ever. I made the turn, and that's when I realized, this kid's trying to commit suicide at my expense, was the thought as he turned when I did and walked right out in front of my truck. I hit the brakes and swerved to go around, but stopped right by him. Worst thing that could have happened besides turning someone's child into a speed bump. We both looked over at the passenger side window and saw his face. He hadn't stopped walking, but I was maybe a foot to the side of him. He was staring slightly upwards, and his eyes were completely white. It was almost like staring at a real-life zombie in the face, since his face had this look of complete cluelessness, like if someone were brain dead and drooling with their mouth hanging open. My ex panicked and screamed, "It's not real! Please go, it's not real!" And I slammed the gas, lost for words. But an idiot, I hit the brakes moments after speeding off, a matter of maybe 30 yards. I looked in the rear view. Nothing. No one. I reluctantly opened my door as to try to just make some sense of anything, hoping there would be a kid there walking. No one. I got back in. She was still freaking out, and I drove to my dad's and lost my mind. I forced him to take us on a ride down the road and through town to try to find anyone resembling the kid. The town was absolutely empty. I don't even believe we slept that night, kept the lights on, watching comedies, tried to forget. Because not only did we know what we saw, neither of us wanted to acknowledge the fact that he never stopped walking, and he would have had to walk right through the side or back of the vehicle by the time we drove off in a hurry. It took a moment before we saw his expression and eyes, so when we swerved around him, we came to a complete stop for at least a few moments, and he was right at the window when we sped off. The most perplexing part of all was that we both knew that when we initially saw him, there was no transparent qualities, completely in flesh, just not. He looked as real as any other real person we'd seen. And that was that. It crosses my mind from time to time, but I try not to dwell on it. Over the years, I've wondered, why us? Why me? Why did he want me and us to see him? Was there any real reason to it at all? I also tried to find out if there had been any bad accidents or deaths on that road, but turned up with nothing. This summer, me and my girlfriend decided to knock a trip off the bucket list and stayed on the 4th floor of the Stanley Hotel for 4 nights. For those who don't know, this is the haunted floor, and there has been paranormal activity in every room. Paranormal stuff starts happening right away. When we step into the elevator and start going up, we both hear a faint whisper, and I bring to her attention only to have her tell me she heard it too. That night we walked into town to a place called the Wheel Bar. Ended up probably being one of the coolest bars I've had the fortune to find. It was a late night, and we came back to the Stanley at about 2 a.m. I take a couple pictures because the lobby looks absolutely stunning with the dim lighting. The next morning we wake up, and as I'm looking through my pictures, I find an anomaly. To me, it almost appeared as if though it was a child. Others disagree with me. Other weird stuff happened, my phone bouncing around on my stomach after I set it there in bed, and my girlfriend feeling hands run down her back when she got out of the shower. We also would hear footsteps in the attic that was above our room pretty much all night, every night. I would say the other creepiest thing was that while wandering the hotel seeking out paranormal stuff on what I think was the 3rd night, we actually happened to run into another couple doing the same. After talking to them for a few minutes, the girl lets it slip that they're staying in 217, the room Stephen King stayed in that inspired him to write The Shining, and also a major plot point of the movie and book. Being a King fan, I asked in a polite manner if they minded if we see the room. We ended up doing an EVP session, and when we asked the question if it worked at the Stanley, we got an audible no. At first I thought it was my girlfriend, but when I realized it wasn't her voice or anyone else in the room's voice, I shit bricks. There was plenty of other stuff that had happened, but the only other thing I'm going to mention is that we had an EMF detector that was supplied by the hotel. They sell them to you if you get the 4th floor package, and we were asking if it was a kid. Got a definite yes. Asked if it was a little girl, and got the same response. I started asking it if it liked games, and the meter went absolutely apeshit. Asked if it liked tag, and the meter spiked up as far as it will go. So I stood up and bolted down the hall as fast as I could. My girlfriend and other witnesses said that as soon as I took off, the meter dropped all the way down to its lowest level and all activity stopped. I guess it did like tag, and that was the first time ever in my life that I played a game with a ghost. It was the summer of 2005, but this experience is burned into my memory as if it happened last month. I was in college, staying for the summer at the school at an off-campus house rented by 4 of my fraternity brothers. As such, it was as a boisterous house, lots of people coming and going, frequent parties, often loud music, all those sorts of things from young college-age guys. This house was built in 1930, nothing remarkable, located in a small Virginian town with a lot of history. This was a Sunday night, and it was a bit different than usual. All of my roommates were out of town. I was alone for the evening. It wasn't the first time to be alone, but it was certainly rare for only one person to be in the house. Oftentimes friends would crash on couches, and there would be more than 4 people who lived there bounding about. I didn't have anything to drink, watched some TV, and turned into bed around midnight. I usually sleep well. I've never suffered any sort of sleep paralysis or even any frightening nightmares. But on this night, I couldn't fall asleep. I felt like I was being watched. I got up, confirmed all doors were locked and lights were off, and laid back down. As soon as I got back in bed, I saw it and froze in fear. What I saw was difficult to describe, but impossible to forget. It was a black shadow in the silhouette of a person, but that was it. I could tell it was much darker and left an outline to the wall behind it. When I saw it, a chill went up my spine. I couldn't see many features but could instantly tell it was looking at me. I'm laying on my back, just frozen in fear. I could physically move, but I was so scared I just laid as still as possible. Was I just freaking myself out? I asked. I don't think I was. The firehouse was down the road and ambulance and fire trucks frequently drove on the street outside the window of the room I lived in on the first floor. I heard the sirens and remained still. The red flashing lights as the truck drove by briefly illuminated the room. The outline of the shadow was 100% there. There was no doubt in my mind some sort of dark shadow was in the room at the foot of my bed, looking at me, though I couldn't see any eyes, and I had no doubt it wasn't a living human being. Then it started moving. Not really walking, but as if on a Segway, just sliding slowly but steadily. When I first saw it, it was to my right, just beyond my foot. It was moving to my left. It got to the end of the bed and turned to me, seeming to rotate so its dark head was ever focused and locked on me. Just typing this now gives me chills and goosebumps all these years later. Once it turned, it slowly made its way down the bed, closer to me. I was frozen with fear, praying it would go away. I considered screaming. I considered running out the room. I thought about rolling over and pulling the sheets over my head and just pretending I was somehow tricking myself into imagining, but I just couldn't because I knew I wasn't tricking myself. Finally, as it got almost up to me, it seemingly started leaning down right into my face, the black silhouette very distinct. I just squeezed my eyes tight and refused to open them. I stayed that way, petrified and awake but with my eyes closed for what felt like hours. I once slowly opened them and couldn't tell if the figure was still close to me or not, but I was so freaked out I didn't know what was going on. Finally, at first light, pretty early at this time of the year, I got up and ran out of the house, stopping only to grab a shirt and sandals and basically sprinting out. I didn't come back until later when a couple of roommates were back. I repeated to them basically everything I said above, and they thought I was either crazy or tricking myself. Since it was August and summer was almost over, I slept on a couch in the living room for the short time left. I already had plans to move out for the school year to a different apartment, and I was so scared and didn't want to stay in that room ever again. Life sort of settled down. Business went on as usual until the following Saturday afternoon, 6 days after my experience. A group of my friends were relaxing, watching TV when 4 to 5 members of a family, all wearing matching reunion t-shirts, knocked on the door. This house had been in their family a long time ago, and they wondered if we would let them in so they could walk through it and reminisce. Weird, but sure. They were older, each one no younger than 50, with a couple in their 70s, and they seemed nice, so we let them in. We pretty much just went back to watching TV while they wandered around the house. My room was attached to the living room, and once they walked through the kitchen, one of the older ladies pointed into my room and somewhat said, "Oh, I remember that room. It was cousin so-and-so's room, but her daddy, my Uncle Clarence, would never go in there because he saw a ghost, and he was so shook that he never messed around in there again." I was absolutely floored. This woman volunteered the information. I didn't even think to ask them if they knew about any sort of weird happenings. At this point, even my buddies were stunned to hear this, and now I was happy I told them about it when I did. I asked if the uncle was prone to make up crazy stories, and she said no. By all accounts, he was a fairly typical family member, not any type of person to come up with weird stories for attention or anything. About a year and a half ago, my best friend of 15 plus years and I took a trip out to my family farm at night after getting out of our second shift job. It was a nice, clear, crisp, early fall night in Michigan. We were sitting there just chit-chatting away and watching the night sky when he asked a very peculiar question. He said, "This place has always had a strange feel to it, almost like you were being watched. Did something happen here? Something bad, I mean?" I just laughed a little and replied that I only knew the stories that my father told me. I told him about how when my great-grandpa purchased the farm in the early 30s, that it was a big family project to keep it up and running. Relatives would come and help with the chores and in exchange, be able to hunt the land for food. My great-grandpa had a cousin that came over one day, helped out, and asked if he could go out later that night to do some coon hunting. He, of course, got permission and set out shortly after sundown. The next morning, my great-grandpa noticed that his vehicle was still out in the driveway, even though he should have left hours before. It was still dark out, but my great-grandpa knew the area of the land he would be hunting and set off in that direction. He walked back towards the back pasture field, and as he came around a bend, he hollered my cousin's name. He heard a strange yet familiar voice answer him back. He said that the voice chilled him to the bone, that something wasn't quite right about it. So he called out again, and this time, the voice was for sure not his cousin's, but almost like a growl imitating his voice. He said he hightailed it out of there, never looking back. When the sun came up, he took a big group of relatives and farmhands to look for him. They found his gun, loaded but not fired, his hat, which was covered in a brown liquid spattering, and that was all. My great-grandpa had looked for any signs of him for over 60 plus years. The only time he ever held out hope of finding him, my dad said, was when the swamp and the pasture fields by where he was supposed to be hunting dried up. After a while, my great-grandfather gave up hope to ever understanding what happened to him. Life moved on, as it often does. So almost 2 decades passed before anything more strange and unusual happened. It was in the 1950s during deer season that the next strange thing would happen. My great-grandfather had now owned the farm for close to 20 years. During that time, he had heard or thought he had seen some strange things. One day, my great-grandfather, my grandpa, and all my great-uncles were out hunting with a man they called, and this is no joke, Indian Joe. This was a man that my great-grandfather had somehow met over the years. Joe was a full-blooded Indian, although no one seemed to take the time to ask for any more specifics. He was one hell of a shot as well. He almost never missed, and if he did, he didn't miss the second time. So here they all are, out in the back pasture field, about a half a mile away from the farmhouse. There are about 8 people back there pushing the field and driving the deer. Sure enough, they jump a few deer. Joe shoots, wounds one, and has to track him. No big deal, plenty of snow. As he is tracking the wounded animal, he heads into the part of the farm that is largely unkempt. Even to this day, we don't do much with that area, as it is very, very dense underbrush, soggy, and just not worth much as land. He is pushing through when he comes to what looks like a deer trail. My grandfather is close behind, learning the ins and outs of tracking. He was about 11 or 12 at the time. They follow the trail, and it leads to a clearing in the brush. My grandfather to this day still has a hard time explaining just what happened. He says they walked into the clearing, and that it was small, no more than probably 6 or 7 feet across, almost perfectly circular. In the center of the circle was what remained of a deer. The body was shredded, almost beyond recognition. Blood, he says, was everywhere he looked, like something had violently tossed the deer around. At this point, Joe took my grandfather and placed him behind him, telling him to take the safety off of his gun and be ready for anything. Joe then proceeds to walk towards the animal, trying to look for any tracks or other evidence of what could do this. They found tracks, but they were unlike anything that my grandfather has ever seen, even if they were distorted by the snow. He said Joe took a look at these tracks, knelt down to get a closer look, then stood abruptly, swearing as he did so. My grandfather remembers seeing a look of terror upon the man's face. Joe grabbed my grandfather by the collar, practically dragging him back out of the brush. On the way out, he swears that he could hear something stalking along beside them about 10 feet off to his right. He never saw anything. Now, once they were clear of the brush, Joe told my grandfather to run back to the house. The others were waiting for them and asked what was wrong, the fear evident on both their faces. Joe told my great-grandfather that the deer was torn to shreds. Then he proceeded to tell him that he should sell this land and that he was sorry, but he would never set foot on the property again. He was asked time and time again to explain what was wrong, what he had seen, but he would never tell anyone. My grandfather told me that in the weeks leading up to Joe's death, he had some form of cancer. He visited him to pay his respects and say goodbye. As he left, my grandpa, one of the most brutally honest people I have ever met, tells me Joe's last words to him were, "We were lucky, you know, Gene. We were lucky to have made it back that day." My grandpa to this day will not set foot back in that area of the farm. In relation to where my supposed cousin disappeared, it is on the opposite side of the farm, close to a full mile away. And that wasn't all. Now, to tell you the story that my father told me, my dad, like his dad, is honest to a fault. He hates liars and has never, to my knowledge, told me anything but the truth. According to my father, this event took place in the late 70s, right before he shipped out for boot camp. He was out on the farm after dark. A buddy and him were having a campfire in what we call the South Meadow, over by the back pasture field from the first part of the story. He swears up and down that they had not been drinking. There had been no drugs of any kind, nothing to alter their perception of reality. This was just one last night, meant to be spent relaxing under stars, shooting the shit with his best friend. He had driven his truck into the meadow. That way they wouldn't have to walk all the way back to the farmhouse in the morning. As the night went on, they began to hear strange sounds coming from the woods that separates the South Meadow from the back pasture. It sounded like a big animal walking through the woods, he said, something closer to the size of a bear. His friend, named Mark, was wanting to know what it was, so he grabbed a flashlight. They headed over towards the sound, not thinking that anything bad could happen. As they got closer to the woods, Mark trained the flashlight on the tree line, looking for anything that could be there. At first, they didn't see anything, but they could hear the crashing getting louder, like it was coming near them. They started to back up, realizing this wasn't the smartest move they have ever made. Just as Mark was about to turn the light off, my dad swears he saw a pair of yellow eyes and a mouth full of teeth. He said that something looked off about it, that something about the shape of the mouth and the placement of the eyes relative to where the teeth were was wrong. He described the snout to be very wolf-like, but much, much bigger than any wolf or coyote he has ever seen. Mark apparently had seen this as well. My dad put it, he screamed like a girl and bolted for the truck. My father, seeing no reason not to do the same, joined him. As he neared the truck, he said the creature let out a howl that was so unearthly, it to this day rings in his ears. He couldn't describe what he had heard to me, only that it was so haunting, so primal, he was sure he was about to be set upon. Mark, who I had the distinct pleasure of knowing very, very well before he passed away a few years ago, corroborated my dad's story, adding only that it was the scariest thing he's ever been through, even scarier than surviving a bobcat attack. I think it is important you know my thoughts of these stories before I tell you the final part so far. As I was growing up, I never once truly believed in these being true. I thought they were simply stories told by my family to scare us into being careful on the farm. I never once thought they were real, and it wasn't until after my own experience with the unknown that I began to question my family and realized they had not lied. Back to the very beginning, on the night with myself and my best friend out on the farm. I told him all of this, just as I have told you. After I was finished, he turns to me and asks why the hell hasn't anything been done about it? Why not a grid search or a low-lying aerial photography to see if there was anything to be seen? I chuckled, explaining to him that I was pretty sure these were all ghost stories and that none of it was true. Of course, that was when the world laughed at me and decided to prove just how real these stories were. We had parked up by the barn, which also served as the slaughterhouse. For the last decade, the farm has been on the reserve list. This means that it is no longer farmed, but is set aside for future generations to use. The farm is now largely just a deer camp. The barn is close to the house that my second or third cousins now live in. As we were sitting there, we began to feel uneasy, like something very wrong was about to happen. At first I chalked it up to two grown men getting scared by a dumb ghost story. But as the feeling became more prominent, I could not escape the fact that something felt horribly out of place. And then the dogs my cousins own went ballistic. I mean crazy. This wasn't barks of aggression, but of fear, terror. Something was frightening them out of their minds. The dog pen was about 100 feet of pitch blackness away from us, around the back part of the house, just out of sight. It was basically a chain-link fence with a door, big enough to hold the 3 German shepherds. Over the sound of dogs barking, we could hear something trying to beat the fence down, trying to force its way in or out. I was betting on it being the dogs trying to get out, and I didn't want to be there to be attacked by 3 terrified German shepherds. As I looked at my friend to tell him it was time to go, we heard what I can only describe as the scariest fucking sound I have ever heard. It was a sound that could not be explained, except that to me, it was the herald of death. It chilled me to the core and sent waves of terror through me. I cannot really go into detail more than that. It is something that must be experienced to understand. Without one more word, we were both in the car and throwing gravel everywhere as we booked it out of there. My cousins never woke up to those sounds that night. Apparently they sleep with a white noise machine on, I guess. They did, however, lose a dog that night and have to rebuild the dog pen. The local authorities rolled it out as a coyote attack and moved on. But the sheer ferocity of the attack was beyond anything that even a pack of coyotes would be capable of, and I believe was from something far, far more sinister. When I was 14, my parents transferred me to a private Catholic prep school. I was not happy about changing districts, and I had a really hard time making friends as a young teen. A few weeks into the semester, I was invited to sleep over with 3 girls I knew from English class. I really didn't know these girls very well, but my mom made me go anyway, in an effort to help me adjust. One of the girls, we'll call her Kathy, brought tarot cards and a Ouija board to the party. I never played with a Ouija before, and didn't consider myself a believer in anything outside the realm of science and logic. I was assured it was nothing more than a board game based on a legend, and because I was a goth, I would enjoy the experience. The 4 of us, Zoe, Kathy, Jess, and myself, sat at the board in the late afternoon in the middle of Jess's bedroom. Right from the start, the board was crazy active. I was heavily skeptical and didn't want to play if the other girls weren't going to take it seriously. They swore they weren't messing around. Strangely, the board continued to spell out things like hello and play over and over before we could ask it any direct questions. We finally asked if there was a spirit with us and if it had a name, to which it responded, Hector. This was when Jess began getting anxious. She told us that when she was about 5, she had a childhood imaginary friend named Hector. Still skeptical but officially creeped out, we asked Hector if he had any other spirits with him. He said yes. We asked if he knew their names. With no hesitation, the board spelled out the name Marie. Now this time, Zoe broke down crying and didn't want to play anymore. We stopped playing to console her, but she was very worked up. Apparently, just 3 months earlier, her grandmother Marie had passed away from cancer. Since we were only classmates, there was no way any of us could have known about that event. Zoe refused to play with that board after that, despite our attempts to get her to say goodbye. Kathy, Jess, and I continued to play without Zoe, which proved to also be a mistake. The place where Zoe was sitting felt ice cold compared to the rest of the room, and the planchette kept changing places on the board without us touching it. We closed up the board, put it away, and tried to move on from the experience. Later that evening, while we were eating dinner, Jess's 5-year-old brother began telling us about his imaginary friend, Hector, who conveniently had the same description and backstory to his older sister's childhood imagination. We asked if he knew anything about his sister's imaginary friend. He said no. All of the paranormal talk reached Jess's mom, who quickly sent us home, and we were never invited back again. About 20 years ago, my great-grandmother passed when I was in my early teens. We didn't live in the same state as her, so unfortunately we missed her funeral, but were able to drive 2,000 miles to visit the rest of my family a couple of weeks later. I come from a Catholic family, so it was no surprise that in her home, she had the typical religious candles and statues of many saints. Among the things, there was a blonde doll in a blue dress in a glass cabinet. We were told by my aunt that the doll's hair grew, and apparently they regularly took care of it, bathed it, washed its clothes, trimmed its hair. They were also convinced that a spirit was living in it. Coincidentally, my mom was familiar with the doll and tried to convince me that the doll's hair had grown. I wasn't buying it. I paid close attention to the length of hair. The hair flowed a little past her shoulders, nothing spectacular. Looked like regular doll hair too. A couple of years later, my grandmother wanted to revisit our out-of-state family members. So what did I do when I first got there? Yep, I immediately went to the doll. Its hair had outgrown the length of the doll. I talked with my family and they said the doll was grief-stricken due to the passing of my great-grandmother, that they saw tears streaming down her face a couple of days after we had previously seen them. They explained that they had stopped cutting her hair because apparently that was my great-grandmother's thing. I haven't seen the rest of my family since, but we hear from them every once in a while, and the doll is still with them. Hair still growing and everything. Totally bizarre. Never did get an explanation about where the doll came from, except that it may have come from Mexico. My mom grew up in Venezuela. My grandpa escaped there during the Civil War and with their savings bought a small farm and some property in the capital. This all happened when she was about 8 or 9, so around 1962 to 63 at my grandparents' farm. Back then, radio was all the rage, and they had just bought a fancy new radio for the farm. It must have been like 11 or 12 a.m., and my grandpa was sleeping, but my mom was up listening to radio shows. It was a kind of a hot night, so the balcony and most of the windows in the living room were open. She was starting to fall asleep, so she decided to call it a night and turn off the radio. She went to close the balcony window, and that's when she saw it. It was a small creature, just a little smaller than her, and it was hunched over behind a large sofa, just watching her. It had very large almond-shaped black eyes and grayish leather skin with arms longer than its body. She said it kind of looked like a gorilla in the way its arms touched the floor. She obviously screamed at the top of her lungs. The creature seemed to panic and ran to grab her arm and pulled her towards the balcony, but she resisted long enough for my grandma and grandpa to arrive. The little guy let go of her arm and escaped through the balcony before my grandpa could reach him. My grandpa went out looking for this gray for the better part of an hour, but he didn't find anything. They all slept in the same bed that night, and they never left the windows open at night ever again. Now, here's the kicker. I figured she just made up that story. Back when I was a kid, I was really into aliens and the supernatural, and I figured she had just made up a story to entertain me. But when I asked my grandma about it one night, she told me her side of the story, and she gave me an almost perfect description of that same little guy. My grandmother is also a very serious person, so I really doubt she would have told me something like that as a joke, even as a kid. Sadly, I could never get my grandpa's side of the story because he died soon after I was born. But it's a story I always remember from time to time because it really freaked me out as a kid. This all happened in the house that I grew up in. We moved in when I was about 2 and moved out when I was about 17. I've got several stories about this house, but I'll start with the little boy's spirit. My mom, stepdad, and I lived in this brick house in the middle of a cul-de-sac in a quiet little neighborhood. My parents worked second and third shifts and would often leave me home alone even at an early age, probably starting at around 6 or 7 years old, but it was never an issue. It was a safe neighborhood and I really just played video games and kept out of trouble. However, even being home alone, the house always seemed to have this "you're not alone" feeling to it. I didn't know any better because I had always lived there and thought that was just a normal thing. For my 6th birthday, my parents had bought a cat, and that was probably about the time that I began to take notice that things were not exactly normal in the house. Our cat would look around the room for no apparent reason and oftentimes just stare at empty spots in the room. The strangest thing was that she would sit for hours at the end of our long wood hallway and just look towards our rooms even though no one was down there. One night while my family and I were trying to sleep, I was woken up by childlike laughing coming from beside or underneath my bed. Being the incredibly brave little kid I was, I yelled, flew out of my bed, and ran to my parents' room across the hall and told them what had happened. Years later, they had informed me that they had been aware of the kid's spirit for many years and often interacted with him with no issue. He would turn on the VCR and hit play on whatever tape was in the player. They would hear him running up and down the hallway while I was away at my biological dad's house for the weekend, or see him in his little blue polo shirt peeking around the corner of the wall while my mom did dishes. The night of the laughing incident and my discomfort with it led them to research how to help the boy pass on. From what they tell me, they left a lit candle in the middle of the hall and an open Bible next to it during the night. I apologize. I don't know which passage as I'm not a religious person. We never heard from the boy again, so I hope he found peace, but that didn't stop the "you're not alone" feeling. The second entity was more of a watcher kind of spirit. He would never directly interact with us, but you could sometimes seem to catch a glimpse of him from the corner of your eye. He was about 6'3" from what we could tell, and it was always just a shadowy figure of a man. Aside from never feeling alone, he was of no harm but did make for an uneasy feeling at times. He was just always there. When I was 17, due to some financial issues, we had to move. We were leaving the house that I grew up in behind and leaving the watcher to himself. I only had a few more days left of high school, and my parents were working on moving everything to the new house. On the final night, I didn't feel like driving from our new house to school in the morning, so I opted to stay by myself that night. The house was entirely empty aside from my mattress that I left on the ground in my room and my alarm clock. At about 3:30 in the morning, I woke up and saw the shadowy pair of legs standing right beside me. It was strange this time, though. He stayed for much longer than usual, and I didn't feel uncomfortable. I felt calm. There wasn't a noise to be heard. Everything was just still and quiet. I began to shift my gaze up towards his face, and he melted with the darkness of the room. I took a moment and went back to sleep. I told my parents about this when I got home from school, and they confirmed having seen the man several times as well. When I was about 20, I decided to take a friend over to see the house that I grew up in. The realtor sign still sat there, and the house remained empty. I went through the backyard and went to open the back door. It was unlocked. I opened the door and looked into the darkness of the house. This wave of sadness and loneliness washed over me like nothing I'd experienced before. I imagine it was a mixture of seeing my childhood home so empty and also the watcher's feelings of being alone for so long. I left immediately, but occasionally drive through the area just to see it. An older couple is now living there. I wonder if they can feel the Watcher Man. I've never taken illegal drugs, never tried them, not once. I've always been hyper-allergic to nicotine and also cannabis. Got drunk twice at the age of 14, threw up twice, and never touched alcohol again. All of my life I've had paranormal experiences, much more than the normal person. Seen ghosts many times, had many prophetic dreams and premonitions, and many strange events since I had a near-death experience at the age of 11. So I was driving on a truck interstate about 19 months ago. I was in California, in Lebec, which is north of Los Angeles, and I was at a large truck stop. This truck stop had a very small movie cinema for truckers. It was free. The film that was playing was with Brad Pitt. He was a tank commander during World War II. He spoke German. Very good film. During the last of the film is a scene where a tank runs over a man, crushing him. At this point, I had a flash that I would be run over as well. I leapt up and ran out of the little cinema, back to my truck. You see, all of my flashes come true. What do I mean by flashes? Did you see the film Noah with Russell Crowe? Noah has flashes of his world being flooded, just like that, but all the flashes were shorter, otherwise exactly like that. So about a week or so later, I'm in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Now, I had a large map book with all the freeways in the country. I used to stare at Lake Havasu City. Don't ask me why. I never planned to move there. I just used to stare at it often before going to sleep. One day, I get dispatched to drop a trailer off there and pick up another. So I go to Lake Havasu and I drop a trailer. I put on my truck's parking brake. I hear the pshhh, which means the brake had been engaged, air brake. So I get out and go to the back and I unlatch the trailer. My truck is still on neutral, and there was a slight decline. All of a sudden, my truck starts to take off very slowly. The air brake did not engage or become unengaged. Panicked, I tried to push the fifth wheel pin back in, which was silly that I now think of even trying it, but I panicked. My foot gets caught under a moving tire of the truck. I quickly turn to run, and I should have just fell backwards looking back on it. The tire quickly breaks my left leg. I think to myself to jump down flat so the tire doesn't rip my leg bone out of my leg. The truck slowly rolls over my left buttocks, my left leg, and my right foot and ankle. Two wheels do, crushing them as they go. I can feel something go snap, crackle, and pop in my left hip and my left ankle. I lean over all I can to the right so the truck does not roll over my chest and head. The truck rolls clear and slowly continues rolling down another 50 feet until it hits a fence. It was a horrible crash. I roll over and notice my femur bone trying to stick through my skin. The accident was not painful at all, no pain whatsoever. I was in shock. Long story short, the paramedics finally get there after about 40 minutes, and I get hauled off to the Lake Havasu Regional Medical Center, where I would stay for 8 weeks. I would go back home to Oregon using a walker like a little old lady. 19 months of physical therapy. Today, I can walk okay, but I can't run, and I can't go up or down stairs normally. My trucking company fired me, assuming I was lying about putting on my air brake. They claim I never did. Actually, I did, very sure of that. Anyway, while in the hospital, they put me on morphine, which made me feel sick. I finally convinced them to give me something else because the morphine made me feel like throwing up constantly. on morphine, I would have the same exact dream day after day, night after night. It was just a group of people under a tree. Looked like 1940s France or Italy, but in color. Just a group of people. One guy would look at a newspaper and then run, like he was excited. Then the people would gather and talk. I couldn't hear words. People looked French or maybe Spaniards or Italians. Same dream, 100 times a day and night. Day and night. During those dreams I got the knowledge that everything that has happened and will happen has already happened thousands of times, millions of times even. Also, I got the knowledge that everything that can happen has already happened million upon millions of times, almost an infinite number of times. While I was getting sick of the same dream repeating itself and the sickly feeling when I was awake, I begged them to give me something different, and they did, and the repeating dream stopped. Thank goodness. And the next night I opened my eyes and found myself in the hospital bed, and I looked over under the television, and there was a figure of a man, very shiny, and what looked like a Heil Hitler salute. He was saluting me. I closed my eyes and rubbed them, and opened my eyes again, and he was still there, saluting me. Have you ever seen an old analog TV when it was on no channel? It had just had snow on it? That's what he looked like, all over, but brighter than that. I closed my eyes again and opened them, and he was still there, not moving, just saluting. He stayed there for about 15 minutes, and I waved at him before I finally went back to sleep. I had a friend who once took magic mushrooms. I never tried them. He said he took magic mushrooms and looked at a tree, and he could see the tree breathing, and the tree was communicating with him somehow, not by voice. Most of you will say this was all hallucination. To the ancient peoples, a hallucination was a vision of another reality. Visions were not our imagination, but the window to another dimension. I had a friend who told me that one day she was very sick, high fever. She saw the wife of her husband's best friend holding a large knife coming towards her saying, "I'm going to kill you." And this was during the day. Many years later, she discovered that this woman actually hated her with a passion, but she was nice to her at the time. She hid her hatred. She wanted her husband for herself. Some scientists think that in the quantum world, all possible realities exist, and everything that can possibly happen has already happened many, many, many times. I started dating this girl recently, and she's revealed to me that she's seen and spoken to ghosts. Then she said that she's seen them daily. She was at my house the week before and asked if there were any ghosts there, because I felt a strange presence in my house several times over the years. She said there were 3, one in the front living room. She thinks he died there a long time ago and they want to be left alone. And there was another one in my garage that she wasn't sure was a ghost, but an entity, like leftover emotions of anger and rage gathered in an area, kind of like the goo under the city in Ghostbusters. The third one she said was always with me. She said that he's been with me on every one of our 6 or so dates so far. Now that she's comfortable telling me about it, I ask lots of questions and generally don't believe in psychics or any of that, so I tried to not let her trick me into thinking she was right when she said general answers and I gave her specifics. I was very skeptical and careful. We went through several questions for a few hours and she began calling out specifics. For example, she called that he wore leather wristbands, biker boots, and a sleeveless vest. She knew he had a green guitar and we rode motorcycles together. She knew he had long hair and a mustache. She even called 2 specific tattoos on his neck and upper arm. My girlfriend knows nothing of this person at all, never spoke of him, and I knew him when I lived in a different state. None of this is logically possible, and I'm pretty convinced at this point, but it's a hard pill to swallow. I don't think she's crazy. She's very intelligent and well-spoken, holds a high position at work and a healthy home life. There's no way she could have known any of this, and she asked me, He shot himself, didn't he? I replied yes. She also gave me details as to how the ghosts communicate with her, and details about how the deaths, like the black robe and scythe, but apparently there are several of them, not just one, enter our realm and take away the freshly deceased. I'm completely shaken and unsure of how to process all of this. Personally, I'm an atheist, but I do see this as completely plausible. It's just a lot to take in. I've only known her a little over a month. My relative had passed about 16 months ago. Shortly after his death, his Facebook and other profiles were taken down. I've asked his girlfriend and one of his best friends if they could give me some pictures of him, but they couldn't find many or even recent ones since they all got deleted with his Facebook. There were several new tattoos he got right before he passed, and those are the ones she called specifically in the general shape and style and exact position on the body. There's nowhere I can see online with pictures of him with his brand new tattoos before he passed. This was when I lived in New York. I now live in Texas. My girlfriend could not have ever seen him before. She knew I rode motorcycles, but she didn't know he did, and he happened to be my only riding buddy that dressed like a biker. She hasn't figured out his name yet. She said she'd like to be closer to me and closer to him to find out his name. If she does, I think I'll be convinced. January 2012. I bought a horse and began boarding it at a very old barn. It was a small, tight-knit, friendly barn community not far from my home. It had been around since the 60s, surrounded by woods. There were 3 barns. The main arena was entirely surrounded by thick woods, and there were small trails in the woods behind the property. Fast forward to June 2012. I had 2 horses there now. I was there every single day without fail, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. I fed the horses and cared for them. I rode one every night as well, mainly in the arena, but sometimes in the barnyard. There were no field or arena lights, just the moon and stars. One evening around 5 p.m., I was sitting on her, letting her stand when she was starting to snort and back up. I looked up and saw this white, gray creature crawling out of the woods towards us. It had a very small round head. Its eyes were just pits. It had a very small mouth, not much detail there. Its arms were very long and thin, fingers also like that. Its rib cage was very pronounced and defined, and its legs were long and lanky. Its movements were very jerky, not smooth and fluid. It slowly jerked out to us when my horse turned and bolted out of the arena. She's a dead broke, calm, well-mannered horse who never spooked before this. She would not go back into the arena that night. I walked her around the barnyard, staying near the main barn, put her up and ran out to peek into the arena, to find nothing except some footprints where I saw the thing. Throughout the summer, I saw it peeking, almost dancing around the gate that led into the woods where the trails were. One night, roughly a month later, at about 9 p.m., I was riding that horse again in a front pasture. The moon was full and bright, and I looked to my left to see that creature running full speed by my side on the other side of the fence. I slowed my horse to a stop, and it took off around the corner and behind the side barn into the woods. I continued seeing it, mainly in the woods, but it was always around. Summer 2013, the barn shut down when the owner died. We moved the horses to a friend's place for the time being, and I didn't see it there. Late summer and fall 2013, I found a new barn. Woods directly behind the barn and arena. This place had lights and was much newer. About a month later, when I was getting ready to leave, I heard something in the woods. I looked down the barn aisle into the woods and saw the creature running down the road into the woods. I saw it much less frequently for a while, until later in fall 2014 I began seeing it in the back pastures woods. It darted in and out of the tree line. I saw a second one sitting in a neighbor's yard. It would sit in the same spot every day and watch me ride. I kept seeing it occasionally, but from a much greater distance than at the first barn. I went with this barn owner to another farm to get some stuff when I saw a very, very large version of this creature run out from the woods, right behind a tree I was 10 feet from while I was alone by the trailer. Last November, I house sat for the barn owners. I went out around 2 a.m. to fill water troughs and enjoy the full moon and cool night. I was sitting in the back pasture when 3 of the creatures began coming from the woods. One came up to the trees near the trough where I was. The other 2 were walking along the tree line. The horses were silently munching their hay pretty far from where the creatures were. I messaged the guy from earlier and told him what was going on. Since that incident, I haven't really seen them. Last summer, I did see one outside my house staring into the windows. A few weeks ago, one was outside my bedroom windows tapping and making a strange, faint, shrieking sound. I know this sounds totally crazy, and I probably wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen to me. I've never been a believer in the paranormal, but honestly I just have no idea what to make of what happened last night. I will say again before you read this, it sounds insane, but please know I'm telling the truth. I wasn't drunk or high, and I was with a friend who saw the exact same thing. I go to college at a smallish school in Wisconsin. One thing this school is known for is having crazy parties out in the surrounding woods. I know it's stupid, but it's one way to make sure that campus PD don't come in and shut it down. I haven't ever gone to these parties. I've had difficulty with anxiety. But after 2 years of therapy and medication, I finally decided I wanted to go to at least one party before I graduate. I'm a senior. So anyway, I talked to my friend Gina, who's known as a bit of a party girl, and she tells me there's going to be a big party in the woods this Thursday. A lot of kids at my school don't have class on Friday, and we make plans to go. So last night, me and her head out down a trail into the woods with flashlights, and we joke about how creepy it was. Everything is going smoothly at first until we go down a smaller trail that was only about 2 feet wide instead of the normal roadside trails that usually go through the woods. I was kind of freaked out, but didn't say anything because I assumed she knew where she was going. So we follow this trail a bit longer and eventually come to a sort of clearing where the trees aren't too dense, and we see a towel and a few bottles on the ground. At this point, my friend tells me that she got a bit turned around, but knows that we're close to the party because she's been at this clearing before, and she starts calling out, "Hey!" hoping somebody will hear her and shout back. When this doesn't work, she takes out her phone and calls one of her friends that she said she was going to meet at the party. The friend answers, and the friend apparently tells her where they are. Gina then tells me that she knows where they are and that we're close. I joke that she better not get me killed, and as we nervously laugh, we hear a nya 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 sound coming from behind us, followed by what sounded like a cross between a whistle of an old train and somebody blowing. It sounds stupid, but it's almost like the whistle of Thomas the Train, and we turn around thinking, what the fuck was that? And shine our lights on a deer standing up on its hind legs with one arm against the tree, looking at us. I know this sounds stupid, but just the way that it was watching us and standing there was the most unsettling thing I've seen in my life. My friend then takes off running, and I'm still just standing there looking at it, trying to make heads or tails of it before I start running too after Gina, trying not to be left alone with this thing. Luckily for me, Gina runs into a tree, and I catch up with her and start yelling at her about leaving me alone when we hear another whistling sound out to the left of us and turn our flashlights to see another deer looking at us, but this one is walking towards us on its hind legs, but not like a person, like a dog. It gets close but walks behind a tree with only its head and neck poking out, watching us. I've never been so scared in my life, and started to cry and started to yell at Gina, telling her to call the cops, like that would have done any good. At this point, I honestly thought I was going to die. I was just so scared, and we heard another whistle sound come somewhere else in the woods behind us. We heard a rustling sound in the woods and were sure that this was it, and we were going to die. But instead, out walked a giant, and I mean giant, like Newfoundland size but with short hair like a lab, black dog. The dog then walked right up to us, looked at us, looked out at the deer right behind the tree, which started to make a nya-nya sound like we heard earlier, but the dog just stood there looking at it, not growling or barking or anything, just staring. The deer then started to make a coughing sound, but the dog just snarled at it without making a noise before turning around and just ignoring it and walking over to us and started barking and baying. A minute later, a professor who I'd taken a class with sophomore year burst through the bush and started yelling at Baron, his dog who had apparently run away into the woods. He was really confused to see us, but saw that we were crying and offered to take us back home and drive us back to campus. I haven't slept since last night and have been all over the internet trying to make sense of what I saw. I grew up in a small suburb about 30 minutes outside of Portland, Oregon. We were a family of 5, 2 parents and 3 daughters. There was an age gap between me and my sisters by 5 and 7 years. Being the baby of the family, I would complain to my mom and she would force them to play Barbies with me. They didn't often play with me of their own volition, so I spent a lot of time playing by myself. My mom started noticing that when she'd enter my room, or any room I was alone in, she would catch me talking to thin air. She would ask me who I was talking to, and I would tell her very matter-of-factly, Charlie. My mom was puzzled and asked who Charlie was. I never met anyone named Charlie to that point, she had said, and I would just say he was my best friend. My mom was a very leery individual. We are superstitious Irish Native American family after all, but she chalked it up to being my first imaginary friend, and I was a very imaginative kid. After a while, she noticed that I was talking to Charlie a lot and grew curious, so she asked me what he looked like. She said that at first I was dumbfounded by the fact that she couldn't see him. To me, he was a solid human sitting in the room, Bruce Willis in the Sixth Sense style. I gave her a very odd description, not your typical imaginary friend who was half unicorn and half monkey. He was a very tall old man with very big hands, and he was always smiling. Charlie always wore sweaters and wore a very elaborate belt buckle like a cowboy. Later, she told my dad about my description of Charlie, and his jaw dropped. One thing you need to understand about my dad is that he is a hardcore skeptic, but as soon as my mom relayed the description he had said, that is the exact description of my grandpa, Charlie. We didn't have any photos of Charlie in my house, so they were pretty perplexed. The backstory of my dad's relationships makes me kind of sad nowadays. Of course, he didn't tell me back then. I was 3 to 4 years old, but they were very close. He was close with my aunt and uncle too and loved his grandkids very much. When my dad was about 4 years old, my grandparents moved out of state from Missouri to Louisiana, which took them pretty far away from Grandpa Charlie, who was crushed by this news. My dad loved visiting though. They had a huge farm with lots of animals and tractors. It was a kid's wonderland before technology turned kids into gamer hermits who were allergic to the sun. He died when my dad was 8 or 9 of kidney failure, his wife shortly after. My parents have never discussed Grandpa Charlie in front of me, and they were sure of it. Both of them were taken aback. Though Charlie caused all sorts of mischief, 2 occasions really cemented the fact that he wasn't just imaginary. There was a laundry room in our duplex that was more like a little corridor or mudroom. For the sake of perspective, when facing towards the washer and dryer, there was a door to the right which led to the backyard, and a door to the left that led into the house. Every time she went to do laundry, she would keep the door to the laundry room open so she could hear me if I needed her. And every single time she was in there, the door would shut, multiple times a day. My mom didn't even connect that it would be something paranormal until she tried to prop the door open. It didn't matter what she put in front of the door. Whatever it was got pushed out of the way, just enough to get the door closed again. The door was one of those hollow wooden doors, not heavy at all, but the house was solid. The floors and door frames were not warped. One day my mom is doing the laundry and the door closes on her again. At this point she wasn't afraid, she was getting pretty annoyed with it. Even though she felt ridiculous, she felt compelled to say in a very stern voice, "Charlie, if that's you, will you please stop shutting the door on me? I'm trying to get things done." And after that, the door to the laundry room never shut on its own again. I think Charlie was trying to show in subtle ways he was around. But one day, he decided to go with a not-so-subtle approach. My mom, my sisters, and I were watching TV one night in the living room. Suddenly, the radio in my sister's bedroom turned on full blast, as did my parents' radio alarm clock. Everyone freaked out except me. Thinking some strangers were in the house, my mom ushered us to the front door, opened it, and told us to stand in the front yard. "If you hear me scream, run to the neighbor's house and call 911. My mom grabbed the nearest heavy object and went to investigate. It took her a minute to realize my sisters and I were right behind her, following her into the dark house. My parents were sticklers about turning off lights to save electricity. She turned on every light on the way towards the rooms with the radios. Both rooms were across from each other at the end of the hall, and from the hall we could clearly see that there were no intruders in either room. After turning off the radios and checking the closets, my mom just couldn't figure out what happened. She heard me giggling and asked what was so funny, and I replied, "It's okay. It's just Charlie, Mom." Apparently, it was a very funny joke to me at 3. If it happened now, I would definitely need to change my pants. The weirdest part was to turn my sister's radio, you had to turn 2 knobs. One to turn the radio from off to FM radio, then twist a different knob to turn up the volume. This was an old school radio. Even in the early 90s, it was considered antiquated. This event freaked my sisters out, but my mom brushed it off and convinced them it was no biggie. An electrical anomaly, she said. My sisters didn't buy a word of it, so we all slept in my mom's room that night. We lived there for a year and I was very sad to be leaving. I vaguely remember the sadness, but my mom said it was tough for me. I told her the house was crying too, which is what was making me cry. Charlie didn't follow us to the new house, or maybe he did, but he never showed himself to me after that. I like to think that he is still around, watching over me. I've always been told that I must have a guardian angel because I used to do a lot of stupid things, and it's kind of a miracle I've never been arrested and or hurt or killed. Now, not all supernatural stories are scary, and my parents were comforted knowing someone else was looking out for me too. Last week, a friend and I were traveling south to Nashville, Tennessee by car. We decided we would break the drive midway in Abingdon, Virginia. I looked online and the Martha Washington Inn came up again and again. I looked at the website and it seemed very charming, historical and comfortable. I booked it. The evening before we left, I decided to do a little more research on the town and its history, starting with the Martha Washington Inn. The inn had been built in the late 1700s by a wealthy military man for his wife and 9 children. It later became a college for women and was named after Martha Washington. During the Civil War, it became a hospital and some of the female students stayed on and were put to work as nurses. It was during this time that a wounded Union soldier was smuggled in by way of underground passages and housed in one of the rooms overlooking the garden. He was nursed by a young woman who used music to soothe his suffering and calm his spirits. The Union captain lingered some time in his mortally wounded state, but was tenderly nursed by Elizabeth. The young girl stayed by his side day and night until he took his final breath. It is said the two fell in love during this time, and today guests have declared they hear violin music playing in room 217, where he is said to have died. Being Irish, I have grown up with stories of the supernatural, so this story didn't really concern me too much, but I was surprised when we were handed the key to room 217 when we checked in the following day. My friend and I decided not to change rooms and promptly made our way down the hallway to the room. It was garden level and comfortable, nicely appointed with a pleasant decor. Nothing about the room would suggest anything otherworldly. As we moved through the doorway, we noticed that the small entrance hallway led to an alcove that housed a sink and vanity, and beyond that a bathroom. The bedroom faced us. As my friend moved through the door, she called to me and asked me to come back and check out a shadow that was silhouetted across the exterior of the entrance to the room. I did so, but didn't see the shadow. We went outside and looked about to see if the shadow may have been caused by someone going to another room. There was no one there, but as we stood there trying to figure out where the figure may have gone, we heard a woman cough. We couldn't determine where the cough was coming from and dismissed it coming from another room somewhere along the hallway. We chided each other on our imaginations getting the best of us and settled in. We got ready and made our way out to the town for some exploration and decided to walk up to the tavern for an early supper. The tavern is the oldest building in Abingdon and was built in 1777, a year after America declared its independence from Britain. We had a decent dinner and a bottle of wine. The restaurant is definitely worth a visit, and the staff are very pleasant and offered to show us the attics where during the war between the North and South there was a field hospital. We left and came back to the inn and had a small glass of port before heading to bed. We had a long drive ahead of us the next day and wanted to sleep early. We spoke to our friends in Nashville and told them we planned to be there late afternoon and would leave first thing in the morning. After falling asleep at about 10, I woke up feeling very, very cold. I was also very groggy with sleep, and instead of getting up to turn on the heat, I just pulled the duvet up closer and grabbed a pillow around my body to create warmth. I fell back asleep and had a nightmare. I woke up again at 2:45 and noticed my friend was also awake in the other bed. I asked her if she was okay, and she said she had woken up freezing cold and couldn't get back to sleep again. I started to tell her about the dream when I noticed in the semi-darkness we had left a light on in the bathroom that there was something draped over her bed and billowed between the distance from her bed to mine and was also covering my bed. I sat up and couldn't quite make it out. It looked like wide white ribbons or bandages, but as I looked closer, it turned out to be toilet paper. Now, as I mentioned before, the bathroom where the toilet was located was some distance from the bedroom and was accessed via the hall and the anteroom where the sink and vanity were. It would have been quite a feat to pull the paper from the toilet roll holder and to spool it across the 3 spaces without breaking or twisting, and in fact in order to do this would have had to have been removed from the spool and then put back on the holder. The other disconcerting thing was that it covered my upper torso over the bed covers and was neatly tucked in behind me. It was unbroken and only tore off when I sat up. There was a thickness in the room, and we both had headaches, and my friend was finding it a little difficult to breathe. After some time, we decided it was better to try and sleep and calm our fears, so we did so, and after a few fitful hours, woke to the sun rising outside our garden window. We both still complained of a heavy head and quickly got dressed and went downstairs to breakfast. We mentioned to the staff what had occurred, and they were not that surprised. One member related stories from the previous week of a businessman who had a much more frightening experience, which left him very shaken and swearing never to return. Another was a nurse traveling to see her family who woke up with the sensation of her ankles being tugged. The same happened to a Japanese businessman traveling with his boss. He changed rooms, but the nurse decided to check out. Upon relating our story, another guest said that there was supposedly a little girl who had been seen in the corridor of the inn and had reported drowning in a creek when she was 6 years old. We believe that it may have been her spirit who visited that evening, as it seemed like a childish gesture. Our headaches returned again when we went to pack our bags, and once again dissipated when we left the room. I am sure we experienced a haunting, and when I went to check my toiletries, noticed that my creams and some of my lotion had been reduced by half. Seems like maybe a little girl may have been playing with our perfumes and potions that evening as well.
In 1914, the Newfoundland sailed up to the ice with a crew of 250 men. On March 30th, 77 men went out on the ice to kill seals. A mighty storm came up while the men were out. That lasted 2 days, and the men could not make it back to the ship. When the storm ceased, other ships came and helped the crew of the Newfoundland search for the missing men. 72 were found dead, and 5 were missing, presumed drowned. The ship sailed home in sorrow, and didn't go to the ice at all the next year. She was considered to be unlucky. To break the curse, the ship was rebuilt and changed so that she would drown no more men. Her new name was the San Blanford, and she was sent to the ice 2 years after the terrible storm. On the 30th of March, she met up with another ship called the Terra Nova. As dusk fell, a fog rolled in, and the crew of the San Blanford heard the Terra Nova blowing her whistle. This was a signal that she still had men out on the ice. As was customary, the crew of the San Blanford started blowing their whistle, and those above deck could hear voices calling out from the ice, and presumed they belonged to the sailors from the Terra Nova. The 2 ships kept up their signals until 10 p.m., when the voices ceased, and all were presumed safely aboard ship. The next morning, a sailor from the San Blanford boarded the Terra Nova to conduct some business. The captain of the ship immediately asked the sailor what time the members of the San Blanford crew had gotten aboard the previous night. The sailor was puzzled.
"We didn't have anyone out on the ice, sir."
But the captain and his crew swore that they had seen 5 men board the San Blanford shortly before 10 p.m. When the sailor returned to the San Blanford, he reported the incident to his captain. The captain took him quietly aside and told him that the report was true. A few members of the night crew had seen 5 men climb aboard the San Blanford shortly before 10 p.m. The men were wearing tattered clothing that looked as if it had been ripped and worn out by the waves of the sea, and the crew could see right through their shining bodies. One of the sailors on duty that evening had been on the Newfoundland when she lost the 77 men 2 years ago that very night. He had recognized the faces of the ghosts as those belonging to the 5 men who were presumed drowned. Their spirits had finally returned to the ship from which they had been lost, and could now rest in peace.
A couple of my friends and I decided to go on a legend trip to the Bridgewater Triangle last March. We went to Lizzie Borden's house, and on the way home we decided to stop at Dighton Rock State Park. Now, before I go any further, let me stop and explain some things. Firstly, I'm a sensitive or psychic person, I suppose. I can sense, feel, hear, and sometimes see ghosts and other entities. This story revolves a lot around those abilities. Secondly, I just want to go over some of the history of the Bridgewater Triangle for those of you who don't know much about it. So the Bridgewater Triangle is an area in Massachusetts that is known for having some weird-ass occurrences, such as UFO sightings, cryptid sightings such as Bigfoot and Thunderbirds, superfluous demon worship, and a very large amount of hauntings. It is called as such because it is a triangle formed by the towns of Rehoboth, Abington, and Freeton, with the town of Bridgewater right in the middle. One of the most notable areas in the triangle is the Hockomock Swamp, It is notable not only because the area has arguably the most paranormal sightings in the Triangle, some of which go back to the Pilgrims, but has also played a huge part in King Philip's War when it was used as a base for Metacomet, King Philip, to launch attacks on nearby settlements. The swamp was called Hakamak by the Wampanoag tribe of the Algonquin Nation. The name means place where spirits dwell. The settlers aptly named it Devil's Swamp. Our first stop that day was the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast in Fall River, Massachusetts. Fall River is slightly outside of the Triangle, but the energy certainly bleeds outside of the area of the main triangle. I had been to the bed and breakfast before and slept over, so I knew what to expect from the spirits there. None of the people I was with had been there before. When we walked in for the tour, we were seated in the small parlor to wait for anyone else who may be running late. I sat in the chair closest to the doorway to the living room where Mr. Borden's body was initially found in the past. Now, Mr. Borden generally doesn't like people in his house, so when we sat down, I felt him come over from where he was sitting on the couch and stand in the doorway, watching us. When the tour guide started giving her speech, he walked away and sat back down on the couch, seemingly bored with us. After we were done in the parlor, we went into the dining room where nothing happened, but the tour guide showed us some crime scene photos. We then went into the living room where Mr. Borden's body was found. When the group entered into the living room, I felt Mr. Borden get up from the couch, but I was talking with my friends at the time, so I wasn't paying attention to where he went. While everyone was filing in, I went to go look at the small bookshelf next to the fireplace. There was a chair angled in front of the bookshelf so that it was facing the replica of the couch that Mr. Borden had died in. I could feel Mr. Borden standing behind the chair and Mrs. Borden sitting in the chair as I was looking in the bookcase. But as everyone settled into the room and sat down, I found that people were looking at me because I was leaving the chair empty. When the tour guide started talking, I sat in the chair so that I wouldn't be standing in the middle of the room. That was a massive mistake, since I sat on Mrs. Borden and I could feel Mr. Borden staring at me disapprovingly from behind the chair. I was going to stand up right away because I was seriously uncomfortable, but one of my friends decided to take a picture of me in the chair, so I had to wait until she was done to stand up and bolt across the room. Some other stuff happened in the house that day, although not directly to me. Two of the friends that I was with heard noises coming from one of the rooms in the attic when the tour stopped there and decided to go investigate. They found nothing, so they left to come tell me and my boyfriend who was with us, and when they went back into the room, there was a large shooter marble right where one of them had been standing not just 30 seconds earlier. One of them also heard footsteps following us up the stairs. On the way home, we decided to stop at Dighton Rock State Park in Berkeley, Massachusetts. Dighton Rock is a rock that they had found when they were building a dam for the Taunton River in Dighton. They dredged it up and discovered that it was covered in petroglyphs. No one has been able to identify or translate the petroglyphs, so we have no clue where they came from or who wrote them, although the theories abound and include Native Americans, ancient Phoenicians, Norse, Portuguese, and even Chinese. Dighton Rock is fairly creepy in and of itself, but what happened in the park was even creepier. Since the park was technically closed for the season, the main road was closed to auto traffic. People were parking in a little flat dirt area off to the side and walking down the mile-ish long road to the park area, so that's what we decided to do. As we walked down the road, it was really quiet. We couldn't hear any birds chirping, and even though there are small streams that run through the area connecting Shepherd's Cove and the Taunton River, we couldn't hear any water running either. Even the conversations of the people we passed seemed muffled. We passed the time by telling stories and making jokes, but we were all spooked, whether we knew it consciously or not. You could tell by our body language. We were walking close together in a line, and someone was always speaking so that we could stave off that feeling. Afterwards, we all agreed that it was creepy, but didn't want to bring it up to each other at the time. While we were walking down the road, I kept getting this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. It didn't help that the woods were strangely thick and full of thorns, and that I kept hearing rustling and movement. I also started seeing things in the woods out of the corner of my eye. I felt like we were being stalked by a predator or that something dangerous was following us. I looked into the woods at one point and could have sworn that I saw a fully transparent Native American warrior hunter stalking us through the woods. He was tall, but slightly hunched and thin. He was bare-chested and holding a bow with feathers in his hair and a quiver full of arrows on his back. I was shocked when I saw him, but he seemed to be the one who was following us. He never came any closer, and when we got to the clearing in the woods where the park was, he didn't follow us into the park. He did follow us all the way to the road until we got back to our car, though. That seriously spooked me, especially because I was the only one to see him. Unfortunately, the Dighton Rock Museum wasn't open that day, so I'll have to go back there when it's open to see it and see if I can find that spirit again.
This happened on the Halloween night of 2008, and is not my own experience, but that of my brother, sister, and close friends. It is long, so bear with me. I lived in Canberra during my childhood, and Canberra is known to be the most haunted location in Australia, given its history. Growing up, I never took the paranormal seriously. However, my sister and her 3 friends did. In fact, they were all Wiccans. On occasion, they would try and contact spirits in the closest cemetery at daytime, but would only experience slight things like really cold air or hearing footsteps. On Halloween 2008, they decided to go down to the cemetery at midnight, and my brother and his friend also went along. They were all around the age of 13 to 19. I was 14. For some stubborn and stupid reason, I decided to stay home. I now know that I will regret that decision for the rest of my life. This was definitely a very haunted place, and it is also worth mentioning that it is one of the oldest churches in Australia, being built in 1840. It is called St. John's the Baptist Church. Excitedly, they walked down, but not really expecting to see anything amazing. When they reached the cemetery, it was all serious business. They sat down in a circle and held hands, with a candle in the center. Then my sister read something aloud from a book. When it ended, they were all looking around for about 10 minutes, and one of my sister's friends was the first to see something. This thing was glowing a gray color, and it seemed to be fading in and out of focus. It was 20 meters away at the side of the churchyard. They were just watching it for a few minutes, whispering to each other. Then my sister and her 3 friends started slowly walking towards it. As they got closer, it became clearer and clearer that it was a ghost of a young girl in 19th century clothing. They slowly recognized the details and folds in her dress and hair as she was twirling her arms and spinning. They just stared at the figure, silently smiling in awe. They were not threatened at all. She was not aggressive in the least. They always tell me how amazing it was, and I'm still so jealous. My brother and his friend started approaching it slowly as well by the hand gestures of the others. Next to the ghost, there was an old big tree, and they noticed the dirt around it was being flown up in the air, and they started hearing this strange, growling sort of noise, like a dying animal coming from that direction. Something started to form there. It slowly took the shape of a humanoid on all 4s, and was appearing in and out of focus. The girl ghost had disappeared. For some strange reason, it seemed to be digging in the ground very frantically, almost like trying to find something that was buried under the tree. They were happy the seance worked, until now. As the 2 boys cautiously crept up to them before seeing what it was, the strange ghost had stopped and everything went quiet. Suddenly, it looked straight up at them and saw them as some sort of threat. With no warning, it started to crawl and float towards them very aggressively while making a screeching sound. On this path it disappeared and then reappeared, getting closer as it did. I would imagine tears forming in their eyes as their version of reality was bending. Never a nice feeling. I told them that they should have stayed to see what it wanted. They replied by saying things like, "No way, this thing definitely wanted to hurt us. We all started feeling tremendous fear, and there was no way we would have stayed any longer." As they ran out, excited yet terrified, my brother was the only one to look back, and he said it was still chasing them, while the other girl ghost reappeared in the same spot. Well, they did not go back for months after that. The images were still too vivid. Personally, I would have gone back to check it out the same night, along with a lot of other things. When they did call Mom to pick them up, they explained everything they saw to us when they got home. At first, I did not believe them. Then I got a look at my brother's face. It was so pale white, it was almost like there was no blood in his head at all, and they all had terrified looks on their faces. When they were telling me all this, they held back tears, yet they were really excited at the same time. I had no other choice but to believe them. Often it crosses my mind that the ghost of the young girl was luring them closer to the evil-looking ghost. But why? 1 year later, they went again, and this time I went with them. It was not half as successful, though. I did, after the seance, walk around by myself for a few minutes. I felt very uneasy and threatened for no reason at that moment. I remember vividly seeing something white and ghostly float over my head for about 3 seconds. Walking away from that area, I stayed about 10 meters away from everybody else looking around the graveyard for anything interesting, but saw nothing. After about 5 minutes later, I swear I saw something unfocused that caught my eye. It was wobbling and flickering like a pale green flame. It was around the same area that the ghost of the young girl was last year. It was so captivating and hypnotic. I looked at it with a smile for about 30 seconds, then walked to the others and said, "I think there is something over there." So we walked towards it. I thought, finally, I can have this experience. But sadly, it didn't last that long. As we approached it, it slowly seemed to be different. Surprisingly, all that was there was an old, tall gravestone. Just a gravestone. We felt silly. We all stayed there for about 15 minutes and didn't see anything, only heard the odd noises from inside the church, like someone was moving heavy objects. When we walked home, everybody was saying things like, "Well, that was a dud." I felt angry and upset. To this day, I still wonder what I saw. It couldn't be just a gravestone. They don't fade in and out, glow, move, or change shape. I believe it was a ghost. Sometimes I drive down to the cemetery just to take pictures, hoping to catch something interesting. Out of the 58 I have taken, there is only one picture of a ghost. I have had more experiences, but that's for another time.
Where I'm from, everyone knows about Highway Sheila. Some people even say they knew her. She was a vibrant lady full of laughter and joy, and she was loving and caring and would never harm even an ant. Judging by the size of this town, I don't doubt that some people did know her. Her death was gruesome and tragic. Nobody knew who or why anyone would want to hurt Sheila. Her death shocked everyone. She earned her nickname from her hauntings right after her death. It said that she was on her way home late one night when she had a flat tire on the highway. She got out of her car and waved at traffic to try and get some help. I don't think she had a cell phone at the time. Finally, Highway Sheila managed to catch the attention of one driver. He pulled in and parked right next to her vehicle. She went over to the car and saw that he had about 4 friends with him. She asked for help and explained her situation. All 4 got out. She noticed they were intoxicated. After checking her tire out, they went up to her and started acting weird, passing remarks and even touching her. She was afraid and told them she didn't need their help anymore and asked them directly to leave. That made them angry, and they started getting more aggressive and even violent. Then one of them pushed Highway Sheila into her car and began assaulting her. She screamed, but nobody heard her cries. They blocked her mouth. They all had turns with her. They cut her and made markings on her body, torturing her until she had no energy to cry or scream. Highway Sheila just laid there. They murdered that poor girl. To those sickos, it made them laugh. They didn't know they made the biggest mistakes of their lives. She came back from the dead, eager and thirsty for the blood of her murderers. She hunted them down like animals one by one and killed them in the most brutal manner possible. Many people have claimed encountering her. Apparently she lurks the N2 highway and tampers with cars as they pass. It's said that she hitchhikes for a lift to her home. I don't know for sure what she looks like, and I haven't seen her and certainly wouldn't want to, or want anyone else to. There's a picture of a house on the highway. Look closely at the window when you see it. The guy standing there took that picture because he wanted to show his family the house. I don't think he ever went back to that house again, and I don't blame him. I don't know how much is true, but if you're on the N2 highway in South Africa, be sure to keep an eye out for Highway Sheila.
I'm a late blind. I never used to get scared of any ghost stories, and I always enjoyed catching up with any horror movie. My friends considered me lucky because I was spared from watching the horrifying scenes. I never believed in ghosts and paranormal activities, not until August 2015. We are an Anglo-Indian family, and usually it has been our custom to visit our family bungalow for any special occasion. This time it was my cousin's wedding, and a party was thrown at the bungalow. We were gathered over there, and the music was being played at full blast. As I cannot see, I was slightly getting disoriented, and I requested my cousin Elvis to take me to a quiet place where I could relax. He took me to a lawn, which was at the backyard of the bungalow. We were talking to each other when one of my aunts called out for Elvis. He told me that he would come back, and he left. I was standing there. It was quite cold, and I could vaguely hear the music from far away. Suddenly, the swing in the backyard started swaying. I was wondering who it was, and I asked if someone was there. There was no reply. I thought that the swing must have moved because of the wind. I started feeling uncomfortable after a while. It was as though someone was watching me. I started feeling very cold, and I sensed a presence standing next to me. "Darkus," that person whispered in my ears. I was frightened, because I had never heard such a strange voice ever in my life. I was demanding that person to tell me who it was, but there was no reply. I was trying to find my way out to the party area because I was terribly scared. Just then, Elvis came back to find me in a panic state. He asked me if I was okay, and I questioned him if anyone else was there around me. He told me that there was no one except for me and him. I requested him to take me away from there, and I didn't speak a word after that. Even after that date, that experience gives me a chill in my spine. I can't forget it. I'm not sure if it was a paranormal presence or my cousin's prank on me. But whatever it was scary. I haven't shared it with anyone in my family, because I am sure that they will not believe me.
This is a story about my friend Tim. I didn't know it then, but the same ghost that was visiting me was also haunting a complete stranger that I would eventually meet. This ghost was so persistent it actually changed the paths of our lives. It started with a dream for Tim, a ghost taunting him about things that happened to him that seemed so real He actually started to believe it himself, even though he had no genuine recollection of it. This was one of his first experiences with a visit from the ghost in his dreams. He found himself standing in the woods in the middle of a dense fog. It was misting to the point of almost raining. He blew in his hands to warm them and noticed he could see his breath when he exhaled. His feet were cold, and he looked down at them and noticed he didn't have the heavy insulated boots he normally wore when he was hiking, but instead a rather thin pair of tall leather boots. He stared at them, feeling a bit confused. They were not his boots, but yet he recognized them. He stomped his feet a few times to get some circulation going. His legs were sore as though he had been hiking for a very long time or had stood still for too long and they had fallen asleep. He looked around to himself to try to figure out where he was. Night was beginning to fall, and the darkness mixed with the fog made it very difficult to distinguish his surroundings. He picked a direction and proceeded to begin making his way through the woods, squinting in the dark trying to make out his surroundings. He felt like he had to urinate, so he walked up to a tree and reached down to unzip his fly. He felt for the metal fastener and realized that there was no zipper. Instead, he found very large, clumsy buttons. He managed to undo them enough so he could relieve himself, and then had terrible time closing them back up with his fingers being so cold. All he saw around him was the shadows of tremendous dark trees in the fog. He found he had no choice but to continue on, trying to maintain a straight path, thinking sooner or later he would have to walk out of the woods. He stopped and listened momentarily to see if he could hear anything or anyone around him, but there was only total silence that fell on his ears. He continued on hearing only his breathing and the sounds of his feet on the dead leaves and twigs snapping beneath the weight of his boots. Suddenly, very far off in the distance, he thought he heard a voice call out. He stopped suddenly in mid-stride and carefully listened. Again, there was only complete silence. He took another step and then heard something once again. It was very faint and far away, but definitely a voice calling out. "Who's there?" He called out in the darkness. No one answered him. He continued to stand silent, allowing his ears to pick up the slightest sound or movement. Again, he strained his eyes to pick up anything moving anywhere around him. Turning a full circle, he checked all directions. In front of him, he could barely just make out a very faint light flickering very far off in front of him. The moment he noticed the light, he again heard a voice from the same direction. He aimed himself towards the light and set out in the direction of it, taking long strides while keeping focused on it so as not to lose sight of it, and he felt completely lost. He knew it was very important not to lose sight of that flickering light. He traveled towards it as quickly as he was able to, traveling through the thick underbrush and fallen branches, tripping and falling several times on the cold, wet ground. His palms were scratched and bleeding from trying to soften his falls whenever he tripped, but even so he could barely feel the pain from the cold. The light was growing slightly larger, but it was an odd sort of light, not steady like a flashlight would be, but instead flickered like a flame would when a fire was lit in the dark. He called out several times, but no one replied. The only sound he could hear was the loud thundering of his own heart beating from the exertion of traveling so quickly through the woods and his own heavy breathing. He felt as though he had traveled for miles and hours, but yet the light seemed to grow further away from him instead of closer. Exhausted now, he knew he would have to stop for a bit. He backed up against a large tree, being very careful as to never take his eyes away from the light, now so very far off in the distance. He laid his back against it and slowly slid down into it into a squatting position against its trunk. He was trying to take some of the weight off his aching legs and feet. He leaned there trying to slow his heartbeat down by drawing in long, deep breaths and letting them back out very slowly, trying to allow his lungs to absorb as much oxygen as possible. It didn't seem to be working. He felt as though he was being suffocated very slowly. It was almost as if though somebody was choking the air off at his windpipe with their hands. He began to realize that he was approaching unconsciousness as his legs gave way from under him and he fell to the ground hard on his buttocks. The only thing keeping him upright was the huge tree trunk he had been leaning on. His eyes seemed to be losing focus as he continued to struggle to focus on the flickering light. The trees, already distorted in the fog, were beginning to waver as though he were looking at them through water. His head was pounding in unison to his own heartbeat. The flickering light began to diminish to a mere speck and was almost completely gone now. He reached his hand out as though he were trying to grab it and hold on to it to prevent it from disappearing from his sight completely. "Please," he mumbled. "Please don't leave me here alone." He felt drool drip in long strings from the corner of his mouth as he spoke and run down his neck. It felt as though his blood was trapped in his head, causing his face to swell and bruise from the pressure. His eyelids felt as though they were also beginning to swell over his eyes so severely he had but a sliver of vision remaining through them, left now with nothing than mere slits to see through. He reached down and tried to rub his legs, but he could not even feel his own hands on his flesh. They were cold and stiff to his touch. He felt tremendous fear. He knew he was fading from consciousness, and he even thought that perhaps it was time for him to pass from here, and he had given in to the thought. He raised his eyes one last time towards the direction where the flickering light had been, and suddenly there it was, directly before him, huge and overwhelming like a great fire. The light now so bright it burned his eyes, and the heat of it so intense his face felt as though the flesh were melting from it. A small bit of the flame fell from the mass and landed on something lying in the grass near him. It almost looked like a belt or a strap to him. It ignited from the flame and began to burn, following its length towards him, climbing up his chest and within inches of his neck. He patted on it desperately and felt above the flame. He realized that the strap was wrapped around his neck. He pulled at it, desperately trying to pull it away from him, but it seemed to be buried in the very flesh of his neck. "Someone please help me," he called out in the darkness. Suddenly the pressure from his neck was gone, and he could feel air fill his lungs once again. The fire disappeared simultaneously, but now there was a figure standing before him. As his vision cleared, he realized it was a woman. She was standing in front of him with her head oddly cocked to one side. "You must do what I say." He heard her words in his head. That was when he woke. He went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. When he leaned forward to dry his face, he noticed a mark on his neck. It almost looked like a tiny part of a rope burn. I too found myself standing alone on a long, narrow gravel road. It was very dark. There was a damp gray mist rolling along the ditches, almost appearing as though it were a gray ghost lurking against the total blackness that had enveloped me. I could see, despite the darkness, that tremendous trees lined both sides of the road beside me. They had no leaves. Their branches were very long and black, blacker than the darkness it was itself. They stretched out over the roads from both sides, as though they were trying to touch each other above me, but then had somehow become snarled and twisted at their spiny tips. Now interlocked and tangled, they formed a tunnel effect above me and around me. Despite the heavy mist and the darkness, I could still see clearly down the road before me and far off into the distance. There, a pinpoint of light. I observed a shadow-like figure that appeared to be moving towards me. Even though I was deep in sleep, I could actually smell the dampness of the air and the aroma of the wet, rotting bark of the huge black trees. I felt fear beginning to flow through me, clenching my body, paralyzing my legs and feet, causing me to be unable to move them. I felt as though I was standing in hardened cement. The figure continued to move slowly and deliberately towards me, making short, jerky movements with every step it took. It seemed to take endless hours for it to reach me. I watched as it moved closer and closer. With no way for me to flee, I could only observe and wait. Now, finally but a few yards from me, The figure abruptly stopped and stood completely motionless directly in front of me. The fog was now so dense I felt as though I was looking through a very thick, dirty glass that distorted the face and made it near impossible for me to make out any distinct features. I could feel the cold, heavy air weighing on my skin. I glanced down to my forearm and observed that the dampness of the mist had formed a few tiny little beads of liquid on it. I watched as they suddenly gathered together to form one big water droplet that tickled me as it trickled off my skin and toppled to the ground in slow motion. I had a sudden flashback of memory before my eyes. I saw the tears landing on top of the grease in my bowl of soup the night I learned of my mother's impending death. I lifted my eyes back up to the figure, startled that it was now but a few inches from me. The mist had thinned enough to clearly see the features of the face. It was a woman. She was looking at me in a very odd sort of way. She spoke to me, but her lips were not moving. It was as though I heard her with my mind. "It's time for you to change." That was all I heard. I found myself sitting up in my bed. The dream had sent chills down my arms. I reached to rub them and found them to be damp to the touch. This started many events that deeply affected mine and Tim's life. It was a scary time for both of us, but eventually we found out what the ghost was really after. They haunt you for a reason. There is something that they want from you, and sometimes you eventually find out what that is.
The soft thud of following footsteps echoed behind him as he hurried through the snowflakes toward home. They kept pace with him, quickening when he quickened, and slowing when he slowed. His flesh crawled at the sound, and he sped up, cursing himself for walking home alone from the midnight Christmas Mass. Normally not a pious man, the middle-aged bachelor had suddenly been struck by a wish to hear the old Christmas song sung once again by a church choir, and had walked across town to attend the service. Now he regretted his choice, as he passed dark house after dark house in the snowy night, and the footsteps ever followed. He sped up until he was nearly running, and skidded into his street. A few more paces brought him to the bottom of his front steps, and as he dashed up them, he realized suddenly that the following footsteps had ceased abruptly. He glanced behind him at the cross street from which he had just turned, and saw only one pair of footprints in the snow-covered street, when there should have been two. He frowned in puzzlement, and then shuddered as a cold breeze struck him, driving snow against his collar, and slammed against the door. Almost it seemed to pass through the door, but that was superstitious nonsense. His hand was shaking as he unlocked the front door and hurried inside. He expected darkness, but was delighted to see the yellow glow of firelight coming from his study doorway upstairs. His old housekeeper, whom he thought firmly asleep in her attic bedroom, must have lit the fire pending his return. He struggled out of his coat and paused for a moment, amazed to find it still warm and dry, though he had walked for more than a mile through a snowstorm. It was almost as if he had been walking in a bubble of calm air, though he remembered the soft snowflakes hitting his face when he first stepped out of church, before the mysterious footsteps began. His shudder was interrupted by a shout of greeting as his old friend Andy came hurrying out of the study. His whole face lit up in a grin at the unexpected surprise. The two men shook hands heartily and retreated back to the warmth of the firelight, talking so fast they stumbled over each other's words. Andy had left town years ago to take a government job in D.C., and they hadn't seen each other since. Nearly an hour passed before it occurred to him that his guest might be hungry. His offer of a meal was instantly accepted, but Andy was unwilling to leave the comfort of the fire to eat in the kitchen, so he jogged downstairs alone to fetch some food. He didn't wonder at his friend's reluctance to join him in the kitchen. Andy had looked very pale and had kept shivering with cold while they talked. He hoped his friend wasn't ailing for anything. A few moments later, he was back with warmed-up meat and potatoes and a couple glasses of beer, apologizing profusely as he handed Andy a plate for the mismatched dinnerware. Andy just laughed and hunkered down to eat. When they were both finished, he showed his friend to a guest room and then tumbled into his own bed to sleep. All his apprehension caused by mysterious footsteps forgotten in the visit of his friend. He jumped out of bed Christmas morning and dashed immediately downstairs to the guest room to rouse his friend. Andy wasn't there, and the bed had not been slept in. That was odd. He ran down to look in the study, but Andy wasn't there either, and one plate full of food was sitting on the end table beside his old friend's chair. It was completely untouched, though he'd seen Andy eating from it the night before. Skin creeping at the thought, he ran to the kitchen and asked his housekeeper if she'd seen Andy, but the housekeeper had seen no one either the previous night or this morning. He flopped down on the bottom step of the staircase, completely baffled. Where had Andy gone? It was a mystery that plagued him all Christmas Day, and he did not enjoy his holiday dinner at all, a fact that annoyed his housekeeper. He was awakened the next morning from a restless sleep by the sound of the front doorbell. He stumbled out of bed and was splashing water from the bedside pitcher onto his sleepy eyes when a knock came at his bedroom door. When he answered, his housekeeper handed him a telegram that had just arrived. As she hurried back downstairs to prepare his breakfast, he opened it curiously, not knowing who would be telegraphing him so urgently. As he read the telegram, he started to tremble. The message was short and to the point. Andy's family regretted to inform him that his old friend Andy had passed away on Christmas Eve in his home in Washington, D.C. He sat down hard on the bed, the telegram fluttering away from his hand. It must have been Andy who had followed him home on Christmas Eve. That would explain the eerie footsteps and the dry coat in the middle of the snowstorm. He'd spent Christmas Eve with a ghost.
When I was growing up, we didn't know about the dangers of a Ouija board. In fact, it was often left as a Christmas gift under the tree. We played with it some back then, but I never thought much of it really. Just figured others were moving it, to be honest. In fact, it wasn't until I was 17 that I witnessed proof, to me anyways, that there was more to this board than originally had believed. My first ex-wife, girlfriend then, were at a party at a friend's house. We were sitting around hitting a pipe with the group. Hey, it was the 80s, when the subject of the Ouija came up. My friend's older brother was talking about it. I was like, dude, that thing's just a bunch of bullcrap. He was like, oh man, it really works. You just have to learn to use it correctly and give it some time. He asked if I wanted to play, and I said no. My ex, on the other hand, was enthused, so he brought out the board, set it up, and they began. I'll never forget that night. I was sitting across the room watching the two of them play. They were asking questions, getting yes or no answers, and I was thinking, what a con. So I started thinking to myself, okay, is this thing really working? Mind you, I'm across the room, nowhere near this board. I start repeating a question over and over in my head. No one knows I'm doing this. I keep repeating in my thoughts, "What's Tanya's middle name?" The board starts going really fast in a figure 8. I hear her ask him what's going on. He's like, "I don't know." In the meantime, I'm repeating my question in my head over and over again. It stops, and I hear her say A. Then it starts again. Then I hear him say N. And this continues. N-E-T-T-E. Then the Ouija goes back to normal speed. He says, "Annette, what's that about?" She lets go of the Ouija with her eyes so wide open that they look like they're going to pop out, and then she says, "That's my middle name." I was like, "Huh, I guess it's not Bull." He looks across the room at me and asks, "Dude, were you asking that?" I just smiled and said yes. Well, needless to say, she was through playing with the Ouija that night. Well, me being me, that really sparked my interest. So for a while, I started experimenting with the Ouija by doing sessions. It surprised me, but it really seemed to be working. I noticed though that just about every time we would sit and use this thing, it would increase with intensity. We would always start out talking with one spirit, but then others would come through and take over the board. This one in particular would come through by the name of AJ. Through time, we learned he was a young boy who had drowned. Honestly, we came to think of him as a friend. But then after a few months, his responses became more vulgar in nature. Sometimes outright hostile. We would start getting onto him, threatening to end the session and not return again if he didn't stop. Then the board would start going lightning fast and it trailed to the letters Z-O-Z-O. This would keep repeating until we decided that AJ was throwing a fit. We would say goodbye and put the board away and then go on about our day. Well, we were tired of it, to be honest. It seemed like every time that we would get on it, AJ would take over and not let us communicate with anyone else. So we finally just quit messing with it altogether. Then through the years, we learned of the dangers of the board and decided, good riddance. Now this is where the story became worth telling. Just a couple of years ago, I learned of a paranormal investigator's research into a worldwide phenomenon known as Zozo. Z-O-Z-O or Zozo is a spirit or demon, and I'm fairly certain has been linked to murders and suicides throughout the world. It comes through Ouija sessions and begins working on the mental stability of its users, searching, I think, for vulnerable victims. Now granted, we didn't fall into his game to that point, thank God. But I think it's important for anyone that's thinking of using a Ouija board to be aware of this thing's presence.
He had just graduated from Harvard University and was living in Manhattan. He loved the city and was beginning to feel at home on its streets. World War II was raging in Europe, and like all other good citizens, he followed the headlines daily and did his part for the boys overseas. Hugging his jacket close, he stood shivering at the corner, waiting for the light to change and wondering where his enlisted friends might be staying on that cold winter night. He hoped they were safe. He shivered, only partially from the cold, and looked around him at the bright lights of Times Square. He never tired of this glittering scene. His eye was caught by two men who were dressed in the uniforms of the Royal Air Force of England. They must be on leave, he thought. The men stopped beside him, glanced quickly at their watches, and then nodded and grinned at him. The taller of the two asked him, in the clipped accent of the British, if this was Times Square. He suppressed a smile at such a touristy question, and said that it was. The light changed, and the two RAF pilots fell into step with the Harvard graduate as he crossed the street. The three men fell into conversation together as they meandered along the shining streets. The Brits were thrilled to be in Times Square after all they had suffered in the war. They didn't go into detail about their wartime experiences, and he didn't press them. He just enjoyed their pleasure in the scene, which was marred only by the frequent checking of their watches. Finally, he asked if they had someplace to be. He promptly invited them to have dinner with him at the Harvard Club, and the RAF pilots accepted with alacrity. The three men repaired immediately to the Harvard Club, where they dined leisurely and chatted late into the evening. The RAF pilots were good company and told many stories, although they glossed over their experiences in the war. They continued to check their watches frequently throughout the night, but he decided it was just a nervous habit they had picked up somewhere, possibly in the Air Force. As midnight approached, the two RAF pilots excused themselves and rose from the table. They thanked the Harvard man for a memorable evening and started for the door. Then the tall pilot turned back and told their host that they had always wanted to visit Times Square, but never had the opportunity. It was strange, the pilot added, that they had to wait until after they were dead, killed in action when their planes were shot down the night before over Berlin, to fulfill this dream. His eyes widening incredulously and his mouth falling open in shock. The phantom RAF pilot smiled sardonically at him, nodded, and joined his friend in the doorway. Then the pilots vanished before the astonished man's eyes, just at the stroke of 12 midnight.